Admiral, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The bells has been ringing for us this morning. And on behalf of the organizing committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Military Power Seminar 2017 with the topic, the defense of Europe. This seminar is the 19th Military Power Seminar held in Oslo and is still co-hosted by the Norwegian Defense University College and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. First, I would like to go through some practicalities. And I would like to inform you that throughout the seminar there will be a live screening of the streaming of the whole throughout the whole day. We have, and I guess some of you have already noticed and are already logged on, but we have a Wi-Fi network and password. You can see it on the screen. And if you don't see it, ask the person next to you, and hopefully she has better vision than you. You will find the ladies and gents room literally under your seat, below the seating area, and with entrance from both sides. And we do hope to keep you warm and dry during the day. So hopefully we will be able to stay inside, right? But in case of emergency, there are marked emergency exits, the main entrance on both sides of the stage, and at the end, at the other end of the seminar hall. There will also be served coffee and lunch within the seminar hall. So, and you will find the time for both coffee breaks and lunch in the program. And also we will inform you on other practicalities during the day. So, with no further ado, let's get started on what promised to be an exciting day with exquisite, I would say, list of prominent speakers. And we have the honor today to have the Norwegian Minister of Defense, Mr. Frank Bakke-Jensen, with us today. He will shortly be giving us his opening address. Mr. Bakke-Jensen was quite recently appointed as Minister of Defense, but he has previous experience from the same government as Minister of European Affairs. And when it comes to military background, I think it would be, we need to mention that you have operational service from UNIFIL, the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, from the early 90s, and that you attended the senior executive course at the Norwegian Defense University College a few years back. And I don't know, Admiral, if he passed or not. Maybe yeah, he did. Good. But first of all, I would like to introduce Rear Admiral Louise Katrine Dedeken. She started her military career attending the Royal Naval Academy in 1983, a few years ahead of me. And you became the first female officer being appointed to the Admiral General level, I also believe. And you have been the Commandant of the Norwegian Defense University College since 2008. So please, Admiral, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Minister of Defense, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Norwegian Institute of Foreign Affairs and the Norwegian Defence University College, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's seminar on military power. As mentioned, this is the 19th time that Norway's most important seminar for discussing defense and security is arranged. And since the beginning in 1999, this has been an open forum where anyone can attend and ask questions about pressing issues in defense and security. And this kind of openness is essential in light of the considerable expenses of an effective defense force that society bears. And the success of these seminars has thus been based on their relevance to current security issues. And it is founded on the cooperation between our two organizations as we bring different and complementary perspectives to the table. Differing perspectives is at the core of these seminars, as their purpose is to spur innovative thinking, present controversial ideas, and last but not least, discuss and debate these topics. In this day and age, the defense of Europe requires all of the above, as Europe and Norway face a markedly different security environment than we did only a few years ago. Firstly, different threat perceptions within NATO have led to tensions within the alliance. Some European member states are preoccupied with Russia, while others gaze south to the instability in the Middle East and North Africa. The US, on the other hand, is increasingly devoting its attention to Asia. And furthermore, there are also significant differences in military spending within NATO, adding to the strain. These changes and challenges are disconcerting. However, such challenges also bring opportunities. The evolving threats can help spur new and lasting partnerships and develop new ways of generating security for Norway and Europe. In essence, we must think of creative ways of solving our current security challenges or risk being stuck in old habits. And today, we are here to address and debate these topics. We have presentations on the status of the Western Alliance and of Russia. We will hear how major NATO powers are dealing with new security situation and how this will develop over the next 5 to 10 years. And we are therefore lucky to have such a distinguished panel that can provoke and inform us with new thoughts and ideas and hopefully sparking a lively debate. And we hope that you, audience, both you in this room and those watching online, will contribute to our debate. You have every opportunity to take advantage of our prominent panel by posting questions. So I encourage you to seize it with both hands. And with that said, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our new Minister of Defense, Mr. Frank Bakke-Jensen. And he has generously agreed to address this seminar, even though he's scheduled to appear in Parliament in less than an hour. Minister Bakke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Admiral. Dear friends, welcome to Akershus Fortress. I'm pleased to see that we are so many here today. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the 2017 Military Power Seminar. Especially so because of the many prominent speakers and guests that are with us today. I would like to thank the Defence University College and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, for hosting this annual event. By doing so, you're facilitating the important and ongoing public debate on security policy and military affairs. This year's seminar will discuss how European countries perceive the threats they face and the implications for their armed forces, as well as discussing their effects on Norway. The fortress that is the venue for this seminar is steeped in history. One of the most iconic images from the Second World War shows us a German officer surrendering the fortress to a member of the resistance. It's a symbol of our regained independence and sovereignty. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general and military thinker some of you might be familiar with, wrote the famous quote that war is an act of force to compel an enemy to do one's will, and that war is the continuation of policy with other means. His insight was based on the struggles between the great powers of his day, where might was right. However, even as the lines between war and peace are increasingly blurred, there is still truth in it today. For small nations such as Norway, it means that we are dependent upon dialogue, diplomacy, international cooperation, and the rule of international law, as well as military power and alliances to ensure our independence, territorial integrity, and political freedom of action. We need to make the cost of trying to challenge our independence, our political freedom of action, so high that no aggressor is willing to pay the price. In other words, we must achieve effective deterrence. We are a small country with a very, very large neighbor. A neighbor that is increasingly assertive. A neighbor that has proven itself willing to use military force to change borders in Europe. We cannot realistically hope to achieve deterrence alone. That is why the cornerstone for our security is our membership in the NATO alliance. We have been a member of NATO since 1949, even before the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons. NATO successfully prevented a full-scale war between the two blocs during the Cold War. When it ended in 1990, we expected European unity, democracy, and human rights to descend upon the continent. The absence of a credible existential threat to Western society, along with civil war, genocide and ethnic cleansing in Africa and the Balkans, terrorist attacks on US soil, and the war on terror led to a change in focus. Thus, NATO and Norway geared up for out-of-area operations. Our advisories were usually technologically inferior, with no hope of matching our resources. Since then, our security environment has yet again changed rapidly in the last few years. The illegal Russian annexation of Crimea and its violation of international law in Ukraine, along with its anti-NATO rhetoric, marks a turning point in NATO's relationship with Russia. Norway has condemned the annexation of Crimea, and we have suspended our bilateral military cooperation. At the same time, we have practical cooperation in some areas, such as border control, Coast Guard, as well as search and rescue. We have also maintained a direct phone line between our national joint headquarters and Russian northern headquarters. Open military channels may be important in situations of high military activity in order to handle episodes and avoid misunderstandings. We, Norway, do not consider Russia to be a military threat to Norway today. It's also important to stress the fact that Russia and Norway have never been at war with each other. On the other hand, Russia continues to build up its armed forces while being unclear about its intentions. Norway shares a border with Russia in an area that is vital to Russian nuclear deterrence and its broader security interests. The Arctic region is thus of strategic importance, while Norway is NATO in the high north. The last several years have seen an increase in Russian military activity in the north, as shown during the recent Russian exercise Zapad. It is changing times. 2016 was the year of Brexit and the US presidential election. This was followed in 2017 by Brexit negotiations and important elections in key EU countries, which took place against a background of increasing nationalism. Combined, this could have potential consequences not only for the EU, but also for NATO and the transatlantic relationship.
There is a risk that Europe's ability to act may be weakened by international challenges related to increasing nationalism and populism. The recent elections in the Netherlands, France, and Germany were important as a sign of continuity and pragmatism. And I'm still optimistic on behalf of Chancellor Merkel. Brexit is perceived by some as a sign of fragmentation of the Western institutional system at a time when the West faces increasing geopolitical challenges. It's vitally important that we do not promote this narrative, so as not to risk creating new dividing lines in the security policy field, neither in Europe nor across the Atlantic. It is, seen from Norway, an important fact that the people in the EU 27 increased their support to the European Union after Brexit. It is an important fact. Because today, NATO and EU countries face serious security challenges from both the East and the South. Never has there been a stronger case for increased cooperation between NATO and the EU, as shown by developments of the last few years. Our response to Russia since 2014 is a prime example of how NATO and the EU can and must work together. NATO's primary task has been military reassurance of exposed allies and deterrence of Russia. The EU's role has been no less important in the diplomatic and economic areas. NATO and the EU complement each other in a way that has been vital in demonstrating European solidarity and unity, thereby deterring Russia and preventing further escalation. The transatlantic relationship is vital to European security. A vital condition for maintaining this relationship is a willingness to share the burdens. This is one area which European nations need to live up to their commitments. It is also important that Washington confirms US support for European security. The US should be commended for increasing their engagement and investment in European security, such as the European Deterrence Initiative. However, such US commitment cannot be taken for granted. Europe also needs to commit. Burden sharing will remain on the top of the agenda. The Nordic countries have somewhat different approaches to security policy. Iceland and Norway are members of NATO. Sweden and Finland are EU members, but strong partners to NATO. Denmark are members in both. In recent years, the Nordic countries have strengthened their cooperation on security and defense through NORDEFCO within the NATO framework. This is particularly important in light of the more challenging security situation in our part of the world, not least in the Baltic Sea region. The Nordic countries have intensified our security policy dialogue and exchange of information, as well as further developed our practical cooperation. My government is pleased to see that the cooperation between NATO and Sweden and Finland has intensified over the last couple of years. NORDEFCO is a valuable supplement. However, it is not an alternative to membership in NATO and close cooperation with the EU. The security situation is becoming increasingly complex, driven in part by technological developments. Developments in technology, including autonomy and artificial intelligence, are accelerating. Today's technological development is ushering in a new area, also the military domain, with new sensors, platforms, and effectors that are connected. Its origins can be traced back to radar, first used in the Second World War, the code breakers on Bletchley Park, and the development of the ARPANET. Electronics has played a major part in this development, but in the last few years it has accelerated with networking and increasingly powerful sensor effectors and decision support systems. Our ability to stay abreast of these developments in the future will be essential. And we have to realize that we have gone from a situation where development in military technology were driven by the armed forces and the military industry to a situation where the civilian sector increasingly is taking a lead. We also see a development where we, as part of the Western security community, no longer have the same relative technological advantage that we used to have over our potential competitors. Technological developments, increased globalization and connectedness in today's society also makes us vulnerable to hostile state and no-state actors. So how to face face and counter these developments. Russia is not an imminent military threat, but she is a dimensional factor that shapes our defense planning. Defense and security are top priorities for this government. We aim to strengthen our military through increased funding, modernization and reform, to enhance our capabilities and capacity for high-level conflict. The long-term defense plan was passed by Parliament in November last year. It was followed by the land power proposal put to Parliament this fall. Here, we are planning an increase in Norway's defense spending by 180 billion kroners, or $22 billion over the next 20 years. This helps to ensure that our armed forces will have the combat power, flexibility, reaction time, and sustainability to meet an ever-changing and unpredictable security environment. We can no longer rely on long warning times before conflict erupts. We need to improve our preparedness to reduce our reaction time. From units that needed up to 180 days to prepare, we are now getting units that can be ready in a matter of a few days. The strategically important region of Finnmark borders on Russia and is the size of Denmark. Its terrain and climate poses unique challenges to any military forces operating there. We will re-establish a permanent conventional presence in Finnmark by establishing a cavalry battalion. We will also strengthen our military border guards. This will improve our readiness in the region. We are setting a lot in motion and are entering a decade that will introduce new capabilities across the board. The Air Force will receive up to 52 F-35 fifth-generation multi-role combat aircraft with stealth, advanced sensors, and long-range precision missiles. New air defense system will protect our air bases. We are acquiring new P-8 Poseidon aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, that will increase our situational awareness in anti-submarine capacities in the high north. The Navy is operating the frigates successfully, contributing to standing NATO maritime group and providing naval presence and security at home. The Skjold-class corvettes are, after many years of implementation and testing, now operational with state-of-the-art naval strike missiles. The Coast Guard will be modernized. Norway has entered into a strategic partnership with Germany to acquire 6 new state-of-the-art submarines, of which Norway will receive 4. We propose to invest more than 54 billion krones in the Army and National Guard to ensure that they remain relevant and combat capable. The Chief of Defense is responsible for implementing these capabilities in a way that makes use of their full potential. This is not just about acquiring new weapon systems, but also about how both new and old capabilities are utilized. To do this, we need to change our mindset and the way we approach the use of force in the future. With the enormous possibilities technology will present us with, we must make sure that we have the systems in place to utilize them properly. We will start working towards improved joint integration with new precision-guided missiles like the Joint Strike Missile, combat aircraft, frigates, submarines, new artillery, and a modern main battle tank capability. The new and sophisticated capabilities we are investing in are designed for high-end conflicts in a contested multi-domain battle space. Our force is small, and although capable, it can only succeed through integration, cooperation, and interoperability. In addition to the traditional domains, Norway has also started several other parallel strands of work in line with multi-domain thinking, including increased ambition and capabilities in the cyber domain as well as space. However, multi-domain in today's security environment is about more than just the military. Multi-domain is comprehensive in the way that it extends across all sectors of a government and layers of our democratic society. To expand our thinking even beyond military and joint operation is a very interesting perspective and something that Norway traditionally has taken into account. We need a broad approach across the government, including health, justice, defense, finance, and foreign affairs to protect us from and effectively exploit a multi-domain approach. As part of this, we have begun a thorough process of reinvigorating and expanding our total defense concept. This includes integrating all sectors and layers of our government in order to tailor it for our extended view on multi-domain. While the core of Norway's security and defense policy will not change, we need to adapt to a rapidly changing world and the possibilities and challenges that future brings. The close collaboration between the armed forces, research and development community, and the defense industry play a huge part in developing new systems for integration of different domains and for developing new capabilities in all domains. Modernization of our equipment demands even better trained and more qualified personnel. Therefore, we have implemented a reform introducing NATO standard officers and specialist corps. NATO has national mandatory service which has very long tradition and wide public support. We are proposing to change our conscription system to improve their skills, improve our combat readiness, and to be able to call on trained reserves on short notice. Now we are in the process of reforming the military education system to provide the leaders and specialists tomorrow's armed forces will require. Specialists will operate increasingly complex systems, requiring particular skills to utilize to their full potential. Leadership is the most dynamic element of combat power because it deals directly with the combat soldier. Competent, confident, and courageous leadership serves as the catalyst that creates conditions for success. The actions of leaders can often make the difference between success and failure. This is particularly evident in small units. These factors are why our military education system is so important. The changing dynamic and complex security environment we find ourselves in today has had a direct effect on our security policy and on our armed forces. After decades of out-of-area operations, we are now refocusing on the capacity for large-scale, high-intensity, multi-domain operations while simultaneously enhancing our presence in the north. I started by quoting Clausewitz and then went on about the technologically and policy-driven changes in modern militaries. However, it's important to realize that some things changed less over the years. Especially what I would like to call the human domain, shows a particular resilience to change. Soldiers require training in order to prepare for war. That's why we say we must train in peacetime as we must act in crisis. The goal is to prevent war. The Parliament is calling, so I'd like to thank you for your attention. Wish you good luck with the conference. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Minister, for setting the scene for the rest of the day with the Norwegian perspectives on the main threats and challenges for us and the response to counter these threats. Unfortunately, as the Minister mentioned, he has to rush to the Parliament and will not be able for a Q&A session today. Hopefully next time. So let's move on. And I would like to introduce to our chair and moderator for the rest of the day, Mr. Anders Romarheim. He is an associate professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, where he is currently heading the Center for Transatlantic Studies, right? And previously used to be good colleague of mine at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Now you're neither good nor my colleague. No, you're excellent, Anders. So it's now up to you to keep it tight for the rest of the day. Anders?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vegard. Distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, my bosses, former co-workers, old bosses, even the editor from Morgenbladet who's been hard on my written op-eds there over the years. You're all here. So it's a wonderful opportunity that I relish to make a fool out of myself in front of so many good people I know. I would like to christen you as the defense intellectuals of Norway, and the front row is a very, very knowledgeable panel, which means that if anyone here doesn't feel like you're a defense and security intellectual of Norway this morning, I'm sure you will be by the end of the day. There's presentation after presentation that deals with the defense of Europe. And we are very focused on engaging the audience. And that means that we have taken great length to facilitate discussions and asking questions. Slido.com is a web address, and I would like to ask you all now, do you all have mobile phones? And if anyone doesn't, please raise your hand, because, oh, there's one. Very good. Raising your hand is also an option, but the preferable way is to log in here and register with that code, X347, and you will immediately be in a browsing session where you can post questions, and my distinguished colleague Amund will be dealing with the Slido questions as they appear. Furthermore, Twitter, it is a social media age, and the hashtag is MILPOW. It's at the back of your program, so it should be very easy to find for you. Back of the program, MILPOW is the hashtag. Hopefully we'll have many rewarding exchanges as the day progresses. And our first speaker is Walter Russell Mead, James Clark Professor, James Clark Chas Professor at Bard College. He's also been with the Council on Foreign Affairs, and he is Foreign Relations and writes for Foreign Affairs. Many books. I particularly like Special Providence, which has become a classic for as a typology and perhaps a theory, although I know that you challenge whether it's really a theory, but it certainly is categories for defining different types of US foreign policy. On Donald Trump's inauguration day, he published a great piece titled The Jacksonian Revolt, which I would recommend everyone to read, and I consider it perhaps the best short explanation of what drove Trump into office, what kind of people, what are they thinking, and consequently, Walter Russell Mead is excellently positioned to explain what sort of foreign policy we might expect from that crowd and from a president such as Donald J. Trump. And with no further ado, our time schedule is very limited, so I will keep introductions short. You've got them in the already mentioned program. Walter Russell Mead, the floor is yours, and we look very much forward to hearing your introduction today. Please.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm not sure I want to bill myself as an expert on the future of the foreign policy of the Trump administration, because I think of all the people in public life, President Trump may be one of the least predictable. And with so many uncertainties swirling around, it really is very hard to say anything decisive about what to expect. But I think it may be helpful to give some background to make it a little easier to understand what's happening in the United States, and that this may help you assess developments and figure out what you need to focus on. Very important thing to remember about what's happening in the United States is that in 1990, when the Cold War ended, what we did not have was a debate over the future of American foreign policy. That is to say, if you look at what happened after World War I with the debate over the Treaty of Versailles and the questions of the future American engagement. There really was an extended national debate. We fought elections on the future of our foreign policy. And while the decision was not to join the League of Nations, not to implement the Treaty of Versailles, nevertheless, there was an American consensus that guided us, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, for the next 20 years. After World War II, again, a great debate in the United States. In fact, there were two. The first debate in 1945 was quite short, and it was, let's come home. And the United States demobilized about 90% of the forces that we used in World War II. It was only after the Soviet Union became a more threatening presence and the problems in Europe grew more serious that we had the debate that resulted in the formation of the NATO alliance, the Truman Doctrine, and the sort of general American effort to build some kind of order among the non-communist nations of the world. In 1990, the decision was simply made, it was the end of history. Democracy was breaking out everywhere. The bad guys had been defeated. We were clearly in an era of permanent peace. We understood how to run the economy so there would be no more troubles there. We understood how to sort of develop international institutions. They would all work beautifully. Everyone would see the importance of observing international law. Life was going to be simple. And so there was really no need to seek popular support for a global foreign policy and an ambitious foreign policy, because it actually was going to almost achieve itself. The snowball was rolling down the mountain, and all the United States and its allies would have to do is occasionally sort of tap the snowball to make sure it kept rolling. That, of course, has turned out not to be true. After we were already seeing in the 1990s that Russia was beginning to reject the idea of democratic development. China decisively rejecting the idea that it would liberalize as it developed. In the first decade of the new century, we had 9/11 and all the complications that followed. Then in the second decade, we had both Russia and China taking a much more assertive policy, and Iran in its way seeking to transform the regional state in the Middle East, an area which, though small in population and economic activity, nevertheless remains very important for geographic, cultural, and oil-related reasons. So, we are suddenly in a world in which the ambitious global foreign policy that the United States and most of its allies agreed on after 1990 has become expensive and dangerous. And so now we are having in the United States, in a way, the debate we should have had or might have been better off if we had in 1990. And the difficulty is that those of us who support global engagement, support the NATO alliance, support the broad effort to create institutions to develop a more peaceful and more prosperous world, find ourselves on the defensive because we had told people, oh, don't worry, we understand everything, there won't be any problems, it's all going to be simple, it's going to be cheap, it's going to work, you're going to get rich through trade. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where people say, all of your prophecies or many of your prophecies are not coming true, to which our answer seems to be, well, trust us. And you'll be surprised to hear that there's some skepticism in the broader public about whether a foreign policy establishment that so fundamentally misgauged the nature of the challenges that it faced is worthy of trust, has earned trust at this particular moment. Added to this, I think we have to say that the West as a whole has discovered something rather unpleasant, not simply about external challenges to the world order that we've been trying to build, but internal complications. That is, in 1990, most people in the West were of the view that the post-World War II social system that we had created of mass employment at high wages in manufacturing and clerical occupations, in which most people could have a job for life that was more or less secure, a rising living standard as productivity grew, that in fact the economy was now, we thought this was permanent. It was, we thought of it as an achievement that would never be challenged. What we now see is that as the economy continues to change, that post-World War II social system is much harder to maintain. The collapse of employment in manufacturing, not the collapse of manufacturing, we're manufacturing more than ever, it just takes fewer people to do it. The disappearance of clerical work, these are changes as profound as the Industrial Revolution itself. And we're seeing declines in manufacturing and clerical employment similar to those of the decline in agricultural employment that we saw in the 19th and the earlier part of the 20th century. So profound social upheaval. People no longer find that their livelihoods are secure. The world that they thought they were moving into has disappeared, and they're not sure they either understand or like the new world that we're moving into. So we have a double crisis in the West, a crisis of external revisionist powers seeking to transform the geopolitical arrangements of the world in some way, and then also an internal social and political crisis in which the sort of basic framework, political understandings and assumptions of the Western world no longer work as well as we thought they did and now are up for question everywhere. It should not be a surprise that in these circumstances, not only in the United States, but in a number of other countries, we see basic political questions erupting into the foreground of politics. We see insurgent politicians. We see a rise in cynicism. We see a rise in a return to some very radical ideas that had appeared at one time on both the left and the right, that at one time seemed to have been left behind by history, now seem to be emerging with greater force. And all of this, again, against the background of an international situation in which it feels that we've transited from a post-war era to a pre-war era sometime in the last half dozen years. That is, instead of international politics being about settling the remaining issues from the Cold War, and we are now in a situation in which it appears that we're trying to deal with problems which, unless appropriately and properly resolved, could lead to some kind of new major international conflict. So in the midst of that, we have President Trump, and President Trump, I think, is speaking for the skepticism that many Americans feel about the way the country's international and domestic institutions, choices, subtle policies are working. If you look at the polls, many of the people who voted for Trump last November did not approve of him or consider him trustworthy at the time they voted for him. In that sense, I think many of the people who voted for Trump were like passengers on a train who look out the window and they see the train is headed for a bridge, but the bridge has been washed out and the train is headed for an abyss. They pull on the emergency brake, not because they want the train to stop right here. This is not the goal, this is not the destination they wanted, but because they see the alternative is simply moving in the same direction toward a catastrophe. And so the Trump vote in many ways was a protest vote, a vote of no. And it's been interesting to see that President Trump has had some difficulty developing a positive agenda in office much less putting it into law. Whether you look at the healthcare system, currently we're seeing a lot of problems with the tax system, and so on. Yet he is still quite strong and quite popular when he attacks the establishment as corrupt, as self-dealing, as incompetent, as not no understanding what's going on in the world. So he remains, as president, more a critic of the system, of the old system, than an effective builder. He is a demolition crew, not an architect. Well, what does this mean for NATO and for European security? It's complicated. It certainly means that the NATO countries who are aware, like Norway, that they depend on NATO and for security. There are other countries in NATO for whom security is a less pressing concern. These countries need to figure out, in a sense, how to make friends not only with sort of blue state America, that is the people like me and my colleagues in various think tanks and institutes, diplomats and others who are part of this establishment that President Trump, on the whole, is not fond of. How do you make sure that your alliance isn't only with blue America, but also with red America, red state America? And this requires, I think, cultural diplomacy. It requires coming to understand how does red America work? What does it like? What doesn't it like? What signals does it respond to in an affirmative way? What sorts of policy goals make sense to ground the alliance? All of these things. An alliance is not something that we passively inherit from the past. It's something that we have to build, and particularly when conditions are changing, when the world is less stable and domestic politics are less stable, we have to reinvent and recover an alliance simply in order to maintain it. So that would be my advice to people in Norway and in Europe who are interested, and I think rightly so, in maintaining the integrity and the strength of NATO and the real commitment that's there. Blue America, for many Europeans, is the part of America they instinctively most like and feel most similar to in some ways. But red America is the part of America that can actually defend you. And so I would suggest learning how to deal with it. And that will have to be pretty much on terms that it finds acceptable, because that's how people are. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you very much, Walter Russell Mead. The Secretary of Defense mentioned Russia, not as a threat, but nevertheless dimensional for the Norwegian armed forces. And our next topic is indeed Russia, and Keir Giles of Chatham House will lead us or kick off that session. He has worked on Eurasian security for a long time, and also over dinner yesterday I managed to find out that he's lived in places as different as Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Singapore. So clearly a man of the world, and we look very much forward to hearing your views on Russia, a topic of extreme interest to Norwegian defense intellectuals at all times. Floor is yours.
Anders, thank you. Admiral, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. In order for any relationship with Russia to be successful, it has to include recognition of differences and disagreements that exist with Russia, as opposed to what has been the habit of NATO up until relatively recently, which is pretending that the differences don't exist in order that you can pretend you have a strategic partnership. Because if you consider Russia's geopolitical priorities, they lead inevitably to a fundamental conflict of interest with the West as a whole. Let's think for a moment about what is important to Russia at the moment. It is protecting the Russian state, which translates into maintaining the current leadership group in power against internal and external threats, whether they are real or imaginary. That, in turn, means ensuring that Russia will prevail in the conflict with the West that many sectors of the Russian security and defense community think has already begun. That, in turn, implies expanding Russia's position of influence globally as a global power, trying to recapture some of the leverage and influence that the Soviet Union enjoyed. And that also includes exerting political and economic control over some neighbors of Russia, in order that they do not present a bridgehead for perceived threats, whether it is military or economic, or simply a threat to the Russian way of doing business. And finally, the consequence of that is that you need, if you are Russia, to break and divide Western unity. Whether that unity is expressed in supranational organizations like NATO or the EU, or simply in the Euro-Atlantic consensus on the post-Cold War world order, which Russia holds is unfair and disadvantageous to Moscow. Russia may not present an immediate threat, but what is Russia's immediate concern in this context? It is to prevent the balance of power in Europe getting any worse for Russia. Developments like ballistic missile defense, like the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, are insignificant in themselves, but for Moscow they are alarming as the start of a trend which can be built on. Russia may not wish at the moment to destabilize the security situation around its periphery, but the trajectory is unfavorable, so Russia does wish to arrest the development of NATO's defensive potential. Of course, it's not all bad news for Moscow. If they look west, they see major European powers in disarray and confusion, including in my country. Later on, you'll be hearing from Rob Johnson about the state of affairs in the United Kingdom. We were discussing yesterday evening when describing what's going on, he's going to be attempting to defend the indefensible or possibly just trying to explain the inexplicable. And as we just heard from Professor Mead, there is questions over the status of the United States as the backbone of Allied security. Russia is less confident now than it was during the early period of euphoria at the United States electing a president who appeared so keen for so long to enact long-standing Russian policy objectives for the United States. That confidence has been shaken, particularly by incidents like the airstrike on the Shayrat airbase in Syria, but Russia is still optimistic as never before about the prospects of removing the United States from provision of European security, based on this radical dysfunction, the divergence between the strategic priorities of the United States and of the United States' president. But Russia is not probing just in Europe, but worldwide. They are responding to a perceived lack of US interest or leadership by filling the void wherever they can. For example, taking the long-standing proposals for a European security treaty to replace the United States as the guarantor of security here, and copying and pasting it for presentation to Pacific nations, presenting Russia as the alternative to China. All of this is driven by Russia's own perception of its security challenges, of course. From Moscow, it seems entirely logical and rational that the West, read as the extended arm of the United States, might continue its program of regime change and destabilization around the world, as practiced in color revolutions and subsequently the Arab Spring, and consequently, eventually, directly threaten Russian interests or the Russian state itself. The Zapad exercise in September was practicing countering this threat. It was showing just how Russia would go to war to prevent another Ukraine taking place on its doorstep, in this case, in Belarus. And the typical Russian response, of course, is not to address the underlying causes of discontent that leads to social unrest and triggers this kind of regime change, but to resort to high-end warfighting in order to shut down popular unrest and prevent what they see as the inevitable reinforcement from foreign backers. We saw in Zapad, and previously we saw in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, elsewhere, that Russia has its own views on the law of armed conflict, on collateral damage, on civilian casualties, on proportionality as a whole. In war, for Russia, the end justifies the means, and the end is often bringing the conflict to as swift a close as possible by whatever means. What this means is that in the event of conflict in Europe, we should expect Russia's actions to be just as repugnant to Western values as they have habitually been elsewhere. There's no doubt in Russia's ability or will to wage a war, at least briefly. The attention to Russia's military regeneration program that suddenly burgeoned after 2014, the attention, that is, not the program, was accompanied by a usually misplaced sense of optimism that this was unaffordable and unsustainable for Russia. Misplaced because it was guided by Western notions of affordability, of fiscal responsibility, even though we see not much of that in Western capitals these days, and of the sustainability of a decline in the population's standard of living when you're focusing instead on rearmament. That optimism was inappropriate. It's now all the more so as the Russian economy recovers and insulates itself against sanctions and Western pressure. And the most expensive phase of rearmament is now over, and there are now stable and relatively predictable supplies of new equipment arriving in the Russian armed forces. And logistics and personnel and organization are shaking down after further readjustments based on the experience of Syria. So certainly Russia can start a war if it wishes to, but can it continue it? There is more doubt over the ability to prolong an operation at the theater or operational level. There's been no testing so far of Russia's capacity to sustain high-intensity conflict beyond a few days. It's assumed that Russia would wish to avoid protracted conflict and would need rapid results, but of course, it might get them. NATO at present is still measuring its reaction speed in weeks. Landcom estimates that local NATO forces at readiness might reach parity with Russia, even if that parity is only expressed in numerical terms, after 60 to 90 days. Let's recall that the operation in Crimea was effectively over after 60 hours. Russia's deployments to Ukraine and Syria have received mixed reviews. Some say that there are symptoms of overstretch in what has happened in terms of rotating personnel through these different theaters. My reading is that those indicators are, in fact, as Russia says, part of deliberate policy. A rule mode so that as many parts of the armed forces as possible are exposed to operational conditions and, in effect, a rolling live-fire exercise over the last 3 years in Ukraine and Syria. As always with Russia, it may not be one answer or the other, it could be both, but what isn't in doubt is that Russia has more levers for escalation dominance and the political will to use them than its adversaries. They can escalate beyond the immediate crisis readily, both locally and horizontally. Steve Covington, a long-term Russia watcher at SHAPE, describes this as going to war with all of Russia, in the sense that there will never be a localized conflict or a restriction to the tactical or the operational level. This brings us to Russia's constant reminders of the nuclear option as a political tool, highly effective at creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt, particularly among politicians, even if it is not necessarily related to a specific military effect. Just like other regular threats from Russia, for example, moving S-400s or Iskanders to Kaliningrad, this threat can be repeated over and over again and have the same effect each time, mostly as a result of failures of institutional memory in our countries. But this unpredictable madman approach, as it's sometimes described from Russia, is part of deliberate policy. Russia's definitions of asymmetrical actions in the military field include, quote, measures making the opponent apprehensive of the Russian Federation's intentions and responses. It is in some cases the opposite of what we consider to be responsible in terms of nuclear deterrence, presenting a picture of unpredictability. At the same time, it seems clear that for Russia, a resort to tactical nuclear weapons remains an operational, not a political decision. So, if a conflict with Russia reaches a tipping point where Russia's aims for a short and conclusive outcome have not been met, instead the conflict looks as though it is becoming protracted and unsustainable, at that point, nuclear deterrence, in the sense of preventing that escalation, will become critical. Because Russia's response to the changing character of war shows that they consider that high-end warfighting will still be central in future conflict. Look at the massive reinvestment in nuclear rearmament, in developing precision-guided weapons, long-range strategic aviation, increased standoff capabilities, focus on electronic warfare, and societal measures as well. What they describe as increasing the cohesion of society in support of the armed forces, and a general mobilization of the economy and of society to withstand the conflict that they see as coming. But with all of this, current Russian discussion, even 3 years after Crimea, is still showing a clear preference, possibly even a fixation, on not using any of those measures if information effects can work instead. Russia's military leaders still say clearly and openly that information warfare is now a means of overthrowing adversary states or achieving regime change without the need for the final armed intervention that was always previously thought of as the final push to achieve the effect. As Chief of General Staff Gerasimov said last year, information effects enable the opposing sides to be deprived of its actual sovereignty without the state's territory being seized. Russia expresses the return on investment of information effects in very straightforward mathematical terms. They say the energy invested in an item of disinformation has a much greater return than the same amount of energy invested in a bullet or a bomb. So insofar as NATO commanders can sometimes seem fixated on the kinetic, on presence, on reinforcement plans, on maintaining whatever edge we retain over Russia in terms of exquisite technologies, if at all possible, Russia would like to take all of those skills and capabilities and investment and make them irrelevant. Crimea in 2014 is still held up as the gold standard of how you can achieve this. They would like to do it again through a convergence of information warfare, cyber effects, electronic warfare, and a small application of physical effect as practiced in exercises. Witness again during Zapad the spillover effects of disruption to civilian communications and navigation in areas as far apart as Latvia and Finnmark. So in this context, attempting to influence the United States' choice of president was completely consistent with Russia's understanding of the vast increase in the potential of information warfare when enabled by the internet, but also there are secondary objectives which Russia practices on a constant basis at a lower level of ambition. The ongoing campaign of subversion and destabilization with not necessarily any end objective in mind other than weakening the perceived adversary. So should we be concerned about the military threat from Russia? Well, in conventional military terms at present, possibly not. There are no immediate triggers for Russia to consider a military intervention. There's no direct threat to Russian security that would demand a military response in the same way that Ukraine and then Syria did. But Russia will continue to maneuver for advantage in conflict in those domains where it perceives it is already at war and where there is no adverse consequences for taking action. What this means is that countries should fear collateral damage where they themselves are not Russia's main objective. Even if a country has excellent relations with Russia, Moscow can see a bigger prize than that relationship and something which is worth sacrificing it. Because Russia continues to look for levers that would show NATO to be toothless and alliance treaty guarantees to be worthless. The area for them to do so is not geographically restricted to those areas that get most attention from NATO. Again, looking back at Zapad, the Aldrich claims of a practice for a move against Svalbard have been largely publicly discounted, but seen from Russia, it is entirely reasonable to consider this option. The Western fixation on the fashionable candidates for Russian intervention, the Baltic states, the Suwalki Gap, ignore the fact that the United States does not get to choose where Russia will take action. We finally see now expressions of solidarity from the southern allies with the Baltic states. Do those expressions extend as far as where the perception of the threat to southern Europe is even more remote, for example, the High North? Especially where Russia can put forward spurious claims to legitimacy of action based under a fanciful misinterpretation of existing treaty arrangements. The opportunity is presented. In the long term, Russia is in serious trouble due to a range of factors about which Moscow is apparently officially in denial. The uncompetitive economy, the demographic crisis which now is hitting in absolutely biblical scale, and of course, in big, flashing, bold capital letters, China as the long-term threat. But in order to get there, we have to survive the short and medium term with Russia as a problem. That presents the risk of triggers for Russian action which are imperceptible in the West, like in Ukraine, like in Syria, where most people did not consider that what was happening would actually lead to a Russian military intervention. We can expect, therefore, another intervention if either the stakes are as high as in Ukraine, or the risks are as low as in Syria. And in all of this, the biggest danger is of Russia detecting a vacuum, either of deterrent power or of the will to use it. As Vladimir Putin said in early 2012, we should not tempt anyone by allowing ourselves to be weak. That is the prism through which Russia views its own security. It is also the lens through which it views the security of other states and opportunities to improve its own position and safeguard itself against the threats it sees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keir. That's certainly a lot to consider for us. Excellent talk and many perspectives on Russia. I'm inclined to just kick off the discussion by asking you what you think of this Svalbard thing around Zapad. It's been a big discussion here in Norway, and it's certainly worrisome to us. So, what do you know about it, and explain your thoughts on the thinking behind such a move?
I'm not in a position to actually give any kind of critical assessment of the reporting, because in order to do that, you do have to have access to information which I hope is classified on exactly what was where and doing what at that particular time. However, it is, in the absence of any supporting evidence one way or another, it is an entirely plausible objective for Russia to consider, and something which, if I were sitting in the main ops directorate of the General Staff in Moscow, I would want to have those plans worked out in detail, especially at this time when Russia's room for maneuver in order to improve its security situation is shrinking, and rapidly, as options begin to close off, as a result not only of their own long-term economic and military challenges, but also because of the belated and slow spooling up of European defense capability.
And another question for you, moving us towards the United States, the hacking of the elections. You consider that undermining American sovereignty? Would you go that far? And how much do you think hacking of European elections is on the agenda for the Russians in the near future?
It's definitely on the agenda, because the perceived success of Russian operations in the United States led them to attempt to replicate the same thing in France, which failed. However, the return on investment is so great, even if there is a failure, because what it helps do is undermine Western confidence in its own democratic system. So whether or not there is actually an appreciable effect on the election outcome, whether it's France, Germany, even as we now hear Brexit, what it does do is shake the confidence of Western liberal democracies in their own statehood. And that is a key Russian objective as part of this zero-sum approach, whereby anything that you do to weaken adversary societies, even if there is not a direct and visible objective, actually strengthens your own position.
How do you consider that from an American perspective, Professor Walter Russell Mead? How is the election hacking perceived by blue and red state America?
Well, of course, blue state Americans tend to think that Russia hacked those crazy red idiots, and red state America thinks that's just one more slur from those evil blues. So, you know, it all depends. But I think one thing that to me is very interesting is that if President Putin thought that by putting Donald Trump in the White House, he was going to have sort of achieve a change in the United States of great benefit to Russia, I think he has already been disappointed, and he should have been, in the sense that, yes, it's true that Trump would like, I think, to, on pragmatic grounds, to ignore ideological differences with Putin. And I think Russians do say the United States under Trump is unlikely even directly to pursue a kind of a regime change policy in the Kremlin, which makes them feel a little better. But, you know, if you think about the key element of Trump's economic policy is basically to push forward at all possible speed with American energy production, which is, you know, the gravest possible challenge to the foundations of Russian power. The shift of pricing power in energy from the Middle East and Russia to North America is a major geopolitical change, and it's one of the reasons that the long-term trends so heavily disfavor Russia. Significant increases in the military budget and modernization of the nuclear forces, these are all key elements of the Trump program. In that sense, I think it shows how, it's one indication of how limited Russia's options are, that it could either have a kind of an ideological hostility from Secretary Clinton, as her administration would have been, or a sort of a pragmatic détente with the United States advancing in ways that structurally weaken Russian power under Trump. That's not a fantastic choice from a Russian point of view.
Also, I invite you to comment on one another's presentations. Was it anything in Keir's presentation that you wanted to comment as you heard it, or anything new discoveries there?
Well, I really liked the presentation. I thought it was a very clear picture. And I agree with basically the substance of what you said. I think a couple of things I would add for shading. One is I would stress the degree to which Putin is playing a poor man's game, and that that his preference for strategic pyrotechnics. I mean, you make this point, and I think it's an important one that needs to be drawn out, is that Putin is like a general who knows he's going to lose the war unless something changes. And so, you know, in American history, one looks at, say, the contrast between Lee and Grant as generals in our Civil War. Lee, for the South, knows that unless he does really astonishing things, the war is lost. Grant sort of knows if he doesn't lose the war, he'll win if he can keep engaging Lee. So Grant has a reputation as a kind of a general, unimaginative, grinds things out. Lee gets, you know, sort of admired for tactical flourishes, but loses anyway. Putin is like that. Putin is a general, is a leader who knows that the force of history is not on his side. But the other thing I would add here, and again, you make the point, but I would highlight it a bit, is that he's playing a poor man's game. Money is the key. All regimes need money. His economic weakness and the fact that the way the regime has formed limits Russia's economic possibilities. His need to keep his internal allies happy by giving them sort of positions of economic dominance, all this limits his options. And so information warfare is cheap. That's wonderful. He needs cheap forms of warfare. And this is why we've seen such a light touch, say, in eastern Ukraine. It's certainly, in my view, why he doesn't want all of Ukraine. This would be a financial burden he's not prepared to pay. So we've got, you know, Russia is in a sense, Russia's weakness is what makes it so active. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. finally, I would highlight, and Keir did a very good job of saying Russia's conflict as it sees it with the West is existential. I would even say, and it's not just with NATO. In fact, in some ways, the EU is more of an existential threat to Russia as Putin sees it than NATO, although they certainly work together in many ways. That ever since the time of Peter the Great, Russia has believed that it really deserves to be consulted on every significant political question in Europe. So if the duchy in Italy no longer had an heir, Russia got consulted on who the new archduke would be. If the king of Bulgaria was so horrible that everyone agreed that we needed a new king, Russia certainly had a voice in who that would be. The EU is essentially a machine for eliminating Russian influence from economic, political, and social issues in Europe. And it is very much perceived that way in the Kremlin, not simply by Putin, but by a much larger body of Russian opinion. I think there's a sense in the EU, because it is such a law-based and democratic and, from its own point of view, quite benign institution, it's sometimes difficult to imagine just what a fundamental affront to Russia the evolution of the EU has been.
Excellent. And we appreciate the historical examples of Tsar Russia and Civil War. We always come back to them. Any response to that or anything in Walter Russell Mead's talk?
Certainly, it's not just it's not just the limiting of Russian influence, and let's not forget Russia thinks it should have a say in issues not just in Europe but around the world for no particularly obvious reason. But also those key factors about the EU that you mentioned, rule of law and democracy, present a direct threat to the Russian way of doing business and how the Russian leadership actually earns its money. The market economy, free competition, rule of law, etc., all are a direct challenge to Russia. And in that respect, yes, the EU is as much of a problem as NATO, if not more so. The question that arose for me after hearing your presentation about the protest vote in the United States was, have we now reached the end of the period of protest votes that trigger political chaos? We've had the United States, we've had Brexit, more debatably we've had Germany. Is there more to come? Or is there now change which is going to defuse those protest votes in the future? Have the European cosmopolitan elites now realize the reasons for popular discontent, why the serfs are rising and voting for Brexit, or will we have more of the same elsewhere?
Yeah, that is an important question. I'm reminded, I think it was a Mel Brooks movie where a courtier comes into the king and says, "Sire, the people are revolting." The king says, "You're right, they stink on ice." And that so far has been, I think, mostly the response of elites to what's perceived as ignorant, nationalistic, chauvinistic, you name it, responses. And obviously, not all of the responses that we've seen have been either constructive or well-informed. I think some of the difficult points for elites are going to be that for many ordinary people, control of the borders is the most, that's the reason we have a government, many people would say. This was something I think Donald Trump said at one point in the campaign. If you don't have borders, you don't have a country. And there are quite the idea of the national community as a building block of world order as opposed to an obstacle of world order. This is something that I would say that many elites in Brussels and Washington and elsewhere have a hard time grasping. But I myself would say if you don't have strong countries, I don't think you can have a strong international order. And a country is not simply, a sort of a legal abstraction. It has to exist as an entity to which people feel commitment and loyalty, and which they feel is, this is the basis of solidarity outside of your own very limited community is national solidarity. So one of the reasons the Nordic countries, I think, in so many ways are so enlightened and so effective is because there is a strong sense of who we are. That can make it difficult in some contexts. Nothing human is perfect. But if ordinary people think that what elites are trying to do is to create a kind of universal, cosmopolitan, transnational polity in which essentially your rulers have more in common with the rulers of other countries around the world than they do with the people in their own home, the confidence of ordinary people in their leadership will be deeply corroded to the point that those leaders, even if they manage to hold on power, won't be able to do much. So this obviously in the European case, this is very difficult because then how do 27 deeply sort of coalesce national polities? How do they then work together? But I think we should say that the EU was actually built by nations, by Italians and French and yes, Germans who felt themselves very much who felt national in the 1940s and saw their European vocation not as meaning the extinction of their national identities, but as actually the best way to secure things for to make their nations more secure, more profitable, more themselves. So somehow I think we've gotten ahead of ourselves. Maybe it's Norwegian to say we've leaned too far ahead on our skis, and we need to, without losing the commitment to the kinds of universal values that very much are necessary to a healthy political community, even a national one, to somehow recover the sense among elites that you do have a greater duty to the people, to your fellow citizens, than you do to humanity at large. There's something special there, and that it's important and needs to be cherished.
It's very interesting and dire predictions and compliments for mastering Norwegian idioms, because it is, of course, an expression we use. You've talked about the serfs revolting in the Red States. Could you speak a bit to the serfs of Russia and the domestic level? Are they positive? Are they encouraged by the defragmentation of the West's cohesion and so on? What goes on in Russia these days?
Well, we're not in a new Cold War, despite lots of people saying that this is how we should describe the current position. But we are in a period which reminds those people who remember that far back in a lot of ways of what was happening during the Cold War. One of those is we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which, even in a connected age, the Russian population is receiving sources of information which are completely unrecognizable from the outside world. Through their own domestic media, but also through the subtle spin that is put on what they see through the internet from the outside world when it is selected and translated for them. The war narrative that has been going on in Russia, the idea that Russia is already facing an existential conflict with the West in which it must mobilize society to prevail, has been going on for longer than most people realize. It is not just since Crimea. It was a key element of the re-election campaign of Vladimir Putin in 2012, for example. So we've had almost a decade now of the Russian population being told that it is in conflict, but also being told that there is good news because the West is divided, it's in disarray, it is decadent, falling apart, and eventually Russia will prevail. Again, very much the same kind of message as you had during communism. There are lots of echoes and parallels in the messaging that ordinary Russians are receiving now from what they did in, say, the 70s or even the early 80s. What this means is that Russian public opinion has retreated to its comfort zone. if you are content not to think too hard about what is going on in the world, or take the extra effort that it now takes to find out for yourself what is going on in the rest of the world, then the self-perpetuating narrative that you receive from the Russian state is actually internally consistent, and you can go along with it. In addition, of course, you know that when the pollsters come calling and say, what do you think of Vladimir Putin, you are supposed to say, yes, we approve, and therefore 80% plus poll ratings. And should it come to an actual real election, I've no doubt that the election result would be the same for Russia. There are a lot of different subcurrents to that oversimplification, but in general, by and large, Russian public opinion is far more united than you would assume if you listen to those Russians that are popular in the West, the liberal opposition that says things that the West would like to hear, but is not necessarily representative of Russia as a whole.
Excellent. Let me raise one issue with you before we start to involve the Slido and questions from the audience. If I understood you correctly, Keir, the nuclear threat is sort of the fallback security guarantee that allows for opportunistic land seizures such as Crimea. Previously, they may not have exploited that advantage. And turning to Trump, that's very prevalent in his rhetoric, that the power potential of America has not been utilized. Just giving away their money in multilateral forums and not getting anything back. Europe is getting a lot of security for free. He always wants to rebargain and get a better deal. So to you, Professor Mead, do you think that Trump could respond in kind and start to exploit the American power base differently, including the nuclear foundations of it?
Well, again, if you're already kind of a rich country, nuclear weapons are very hard to use. This is especially once other people have them. And I think that Putin definitely is invoking the nuclear power a lot, in part because it's an immense cost for him. If you look at the assets he inherited from the Soviet Union, the nuclear arsenal is one of the biggest. It's a very expensive one to maintain. And so you can see him looking for lots of ways to try to use the darn thing. And he knows that if he doesn't keep it up to at least some degree, he will gradually lose what usefulness he's got out of it. So it's a huge sunk cost that has high maintenance that he's committed to use. So he's going to try to invoke it. It plays less of a role in American thinking simply because by and large America is, even under the Trump administration, mostly a status quo power that is trying to avoid big changes rather than to create them. Trump's interest, so I certainly wouldn't see Trump threatening to bomb someone over imports. But I do think that Trump has since the 1980s, a characteristic element of his worldview has been that the multilateral system represents a giveaway by Americans to the rest of the world. And so he sees a country like Germany, and he sees a country which doesn't do even a minimal fair, which needs defense from the United States, but for years has been a free rider, meanwhile has also rather systematically gone about creating an immense trade surplus so that Germany is exporting its social problems. But Germany doesn't have a lot of unemployed manufacturer workers at home. It creates them abroad. And so Trump wants to change that. How much luck he'll have, I don't know. But I would also say that whether or not this is something that he really makes a lot of progress on, I think it's actually, it's showing that American presidents in the past haven't done a good enough job of conveying the sense that they are out there for the average American. When President Trump shocked opinion in the U.S. and elsewhere when he said America first. And lots of historians went, oh, America first, that's what Charles Lindbergh said in the 1940s. It's fascism, it's isolationism, and so on and so on. Most Americans, I know this is going to shock you, don't study their own political history in the 1940s that much, and don't know and don't really care what Charles Lindbergh said. But, you know, for the average American, when Trump says America first, they think, well, yeah. I mean, he's president of the United States. That's kind of his job, all right? Just like it's the job of the president of France to have France first. And so the fact that the entire elite constituency of the United States acted as if, you know, he uttered some terrible blasphemy, when in fact what he said rang to to the average person is simple common sense. It was one of the ways in which Trump was very brilliantly able to use the delusions and misconceptions of elites to marginalize them. Yes, America first. You know, now that I don't think means America alone, but to the degree that Trump restores confidence among the American people that the American leadership is actually putting the interests of Americans first, that's what it goes into in negotiations. Yes, you compromise. Yes, in fact, you can get more for America by working with others than you can completely alone. That's obvious. But people weren't sure and aren't sure that the classic American politicians are thinking that way. So in this sense, Trump is more a mirror that can show us what the establishment has gotten wrong, and we need to learn from this. Now, whether he in fact will then go on to do something constructive with the governing opportunity he has, I can't predict. I don't know.
Yep. Thank you. And turning to questions from the audience, there's a lot of elites that red state America does not approve of, but the military is not among them. And a question has been put, to what degree will the US military act independently of President Trump? Is that conceivable?
No. You know, again, it's, you know, I was at Halifax a couple of days ago, and a general there made a lot of news. Normally something generals don't like to do is make news, by saying that if the president gave him an order, you know, to use nuclear weapons, he would not obey an illegal order. Those of you who are professional military know that that's the right answer to any question. You will not obey an illegal order. And this was the most conventional utterance possible. The fact that sort of the press has turned this into some kind of major rift, civil military rift and so on, again, is a simple reflection of the emotions and concerns that they have about Trump. But there's nothing to suggest that civil-military relationships the civil-military relationship is profoundly changed in the United States.
Excellent. And next question. It's a little bit hard for you to see. I have to read them aloud anyway because of the streaming. Is it possible that Russia would test NATO through an annexation of parts of the Baltics? And what would the US-NATO response be in response to an Article 5?
Would you like to go first? Is it possible? Of course it is possible. It is a much reduced possibility now that NATO's enhanced forward presence is in the Baltic states. Not because it is a a force which is sufficiently large to prevent any kind of realistic deterrent if Russia wished to act, but it is the simple presence of different NATO nations which complicates Russia's planning by immediately involving the rest of NATO and making that second part of the question about the Article 5 response much less of something that Russia could influence by simply subverting a single NATO member, as they might previously have wished to do. Yes, the Baltic states are and have been for some time the poster children for potential Russian intervention, but one of the things that I was trying to stress in the presentation is we do need to look along a much longer front than that, to look for all of the potential opportunities where Russia could do the same thing, where we have not necessarily closed the gaps and constrained the freedom of movement that Russia would enjoy. So the Baltic states, in my mind, far less of a target for Russia now, especially given the local focus on resilience in addition to conventional deterrence, on closing the seams which Russian, I hesitate to use the term, but everybody else says it, Russian hybrid warfare would seek to exploit, by reducing the leverage that Russia would have in order to actually weaken the local governments. All of those measures together make the Baltic states a far less attractive prospect for the kind of maneuver that you're describing than they were even just a couple of years ago.
That's very interesting. And a follow-up, what is, if you had to put your money down on it, the most likely next conflict area for exposed to Russian aggression? Transnistria, Svalbard, larger parts of Ukraine. What's your take on such a question?
Well, these things go in phases. There is a life cycle of the Russian intervention scenario where, as far as I can tell, it becomes considered as an option in classified circles, leaks through into the academic world, eventually becomes the popular subject in the media, by which time all of the others have already moved on to the next thing. So the Baltic states, as I said, have been the most popular ones for quite a while. Belarus is starting to replace them as the most likely flashpoint where Russian interests would be threatened to exactly the same extent as they were in Ukraine, and Russia would therefore feel compelled to act. But of course, it's not the only candidate. It might well be that Svalbard is the next fashionable victim. In the meantime, there are other wild cards which don't get nearly as much publicity. For example, the extended phased adaptive approach to ballistic missile defense in Europe has been a Russian bugbear for as long as it has been on the table, indeed before, through its various incarnations. Russia has stated clearly and repeatedly that it will take action against the EPAA site in Redzikovo in northern Poland. And it is the case that when Russia says long and hard enough that it's going to do something, they do eventually do it. Now, most people discount the possibility of any kind of overt action against that anti-missile site because of reliance on Article 5. Russia, on the other hand, has read Article 5 in detail and realizes just how full of loopholes it is. So again, one of the options that I would strongly urge the Russian General Staff to consider is how exactly can you neutralize this threat, but at the same time show NATO to be a paper tiger.
Excellent. Another question from the Slido, if you please, Armin. Also, a follow-up to that. The US Marines now have a permanent rotational force in mid-Norway, and it has been somewhat controversial in Norwegian defense policy discussions. How do you think Russia perceives of that? Do they care, or is this just a small piece in a very large, on a very large chessboard?
It's a small piece, but again, it is the precedent that has been set that is of concern for Russia. It's the trajectory, it's what happens in the long term. Yes, they followed closely the debate in the United States about the merits of rotational versus permanent forces. And there's no doubt that if there were a shift in that debate and there were a move towards placing permanent forces on Russia's borders, this would actually be extremely bad news in Moscow. So that debate in and of itself has a deterrent potential all of its own. If the possibility is still there of placing permanent forces close to Russia, that in itself is a deterrent to Russia escalating the security situation in any way, because it would undoubtedly be a direct challenge which made Russia feel very uncomfortable.
Next one is for Professor Mead. What does Red America want internationally? What kind of interest do they have in international engagement?
Well, I suppose, like a lot of people, what they really want is for the world to leave them alone so they can get on about their business. But I think beyond that, I would say respect. That there's a sense that if you travel in states like Alabama, the state where I was born, South Carolina, and some others, what you sense is that there are a lot of fancy people in Europe who think you are really horrible, but do want you to defend them from their enemies, and don't, but otherwise want nothing to do with you. And that's not a solid foundation for an alliance. What do they what to them looks like a good ally? I think, probably the ally that most red state Americans would say is America's best ally would be Israel. And this right away will tell you something of the cultural gap that exists. But here they look at Israel, there's a country that's very tough on defense, spends a lot of money, doesn't actually ask for U.S. troops to play a direct role in defending it, but is, if anything, more aggressive than the United States on facing what might look like common threats. That they're not afraid to use their own military forces. They're not particularly fond of terrorism or terrorists. Those are signals, and if you look sort of poll after poll, will show that Israel is a country that Americans at large consider to be a really close ally. I think usually sort of England and Canada come out ahead of Israel, but rarely anybody else. So, in that sense, it's how could you look more like Israel to the average American? And already I can see heads exploding across Europe as people think about that.
Excellent. To Giles, you touched upon the alternative to China. And the question from the audience is whether Russo-Chinese cooperation is a threat to the West and how it could be stopped. And can you expand on potential long-term effects of increased tension between Russia and China?
Russia will do anything at present and presumably into the medium and long term to prevent increased tension with China. This is one of the reasons why in all Russian security and planning documentation that is publicly visible, China basically doesn't exist. Because they can complain about the West as much as they like. They can keep hitting NATO with the rhetorical stick. But the moment you admit to any kind of problem in the relationship with China, it causes instant pain, diplomatic or economic or political pain. Therefore, Russia towards China has the same attitude that NATO had towards Russia up until recently. Pretend that everything is fine in order that we don't pay attention to the differences, which in the long term are going to be a serious problem. What Russia faces with the relative paths of the two countries is eventually becoming an annex, a Finlandized annex of China. The interest for Russia is how to manage that decline as gracefully as possible. So, does the Russia-China axis prevent a threat to the West? Possibly in the long term, but in the short term, it also presents an opportunity. In terms of leveraging relationships, much more could be made of the fact that there are inherent contradictions between Russian and Chinese interests in the Far East. There is a commonality of interest with China in containing Russia, which has not been made use of so far.
Thank you. Please, a microphone to the gentleman here. We can post questions both in, with Slido and by raising your hands. This might be our, one of our final questions. One of the reasons we use Slido is that we get through a lot more questions. So a quick question, please.
Speaking as an American red stater, Walter, thank you for a balanced, a couple points. Number one, Trump has made very good appointments. H.R. McMaster, with whom I had an encounter over here a year ago, and Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis. And if he had any hesitation about pushing the nuclear retaliatory button, I'm sure they would take his finger to help him do it. Secondly, our reaction was against the neoconservatives, who are very much part of the elite, but they're very pro-Israel. And these exporting coups and wars isn't the American thing to do, and we wanted that stopped. As far as the Ukraine, which is, we are the aggressors in that case. The revolution wasn't a revolution, it was an externally fomented coup. Bernard-Henri Lévy was here 2 years ago gloating about this. And Russia feels just as threatened as we did in October 1983 when there was a pro-Soviet coup on Grenada Island. And what did President Reagan do? Aren't the Russians going to have, if we don't give them a fair peace treaty, which starts with letting them keep the Crimea, aren't the Russians going to have to take all of Ukraine? It's not just Putin, it's also Naryshkin and Gerasimov. And there's a hardliner lobby. Finally, Secretary General Stoltenberg has said the threat to Europe is not just from Russia, and we're very fixated with Russia right here, but also from Asia. The Chinese were participating in shore bombardment exercises in the Baltic Sea a few months ago. So shouldn't there be a global outlook as far as, and then finally, the American military, following West Point Association of Graduates just awarded the Sylvanus Thayer Award to George Bush, who is an anathema to red staters. And there is a division. There is the West Point graduate and officer who is a self-declared Bolshevik, was radicalized at West Point. So there seems to be a division within the military between the rank and file, who are fairly pro-Trump, and the elitists who are very neoconservative. But my question is, doesn't Russia have to take all of Ukraine now?
Thank you.
Thank you, members.
It can't afford it. Putin is cheap. He doesn't have any money. Ukraine costs money. And he doesn't have it. I think the key to Ukraine, in my view, is that the Ukrainian oligarchs, who still basically run the country, although there is a civil society movement that would like to, they want to kind of slither along between Putin on the one side and the West on the other. That is, they don't want Putin to come in and redistribute all of their stuff to his own people, but they also don't want a bunch of boring EU accountants and lawyers to come in, and tax officials and all of that kind of stuff. So, so in a sense, the de facto compromise that the West and Russia have come to in Ukraine is that we're basically pumping in money that keeps this sort of thing slithering along. Russia has Ukraine. What Putin really doesn't want to see, can't afford in Ukraine, would actually be the consolidation of a stable, pro-European government in Ukraine, because that's a message in Russia that says, if the Ukrainians can do that, we can do that. And Putin's political argument now in Russia is, look, all of this representative stuff and all this stuff, that works in like Finland, and it works in crazy places like, the Netherlands, but it doesn't work for us Orthodox Slavs. And if it's sitting there brilliantly working in Ukraine, Putin has a very, very difficult political horizon. So all Putin needs to do to more or less get what he wants in Ukraine is for Ukraine to fail to modernize. That's actually a fairly easy thing to achieve. And while, and the West is sort of trying, I would say somewhat half-heartedly, to make Ukraine, help Ukraine modernize, we haven't seen a lot of progress in that direction. So I think this is one of those status quos that works fairly well for everybody except for maybe people in Ukraine who don't want to be ruled by oligarchs. And the likelihood is that the West, and neither the West nor Russia, is going to make substantial moves that disturb that status quo. And remember, right now, the West is helping Ukraine pay its bills fundamentally to Russia. So why, Putin doesn't want to, we would say, fine, it's yours, now you pay their Gazprom bill.
Thank you. We are running slightly over time, and a 30-second answer from you, Keir, to how should the West de-escalate the Russians and the Russian-West relationship. We focus a lot on deterrence. What about reassurance? A quick flash answer at the end here.
Reassurance is not going to work. You cannot deter an attitude on Russia. You cannot deter a deeply entrenched worldview. What you can do instead is the very first point I made, which is engage with it and recognize the differences in order that it is easier to identify those areas, those very few areas where there are common interests.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for the great questions. Coffee for everyone. See you in 30 minutes. Thank you, Professor.
hey, hey, hey. Yeah, hey, hey. Yeah, ha, ha. Hey, hey, hey. Yeah, two, hey, hey, hey. Hey, yeah, ha. Yeah, ha, ha. Yeah, hey, hey, hey. Ha, ha.
Find your seats, everyone. Wow. Yes. A riveting start, I would say. Thank you so much to our first panelists. They will return after lunch for the full-out 7 panelist discussion. That means that great questions, we have many of them in store already, may be revoked in that session. So keep the questions coming, and Armin will moderate, and we have the prospects of wonderful discussions after lunch. But before that, we need to speedily move into the remaining panelists, going into detail on specific countries. And like our first 2 speakers, we hope they will be fairly consistent with the time specifications we've given to them, because we have a riveting program and it's going to go fast. So without further ado, our next speaker is Claudia Major, and she got her degree from the Freie Universität of Berlin, and is working at the International Security Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So if you would please come to the podium, we will be learning about the German perspectives. And the floor is yours, Claudia, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. And a big thank you to be here. I'm really delighted to be here. First of all, on this wonderful building, and then particularly on that topic and on that really, really excellent panel. I would like to explain German secure defense policy in a bit broader dimension, and actually try to explain why Germany takes the position it takes, or it has been taking for the last 4 years. And maybe also a bit how election-proof these settings are, because as you know, we have a rather interesting political situation in the moment, and we might be heading towards new election next spring. Nobody knows in the moment. The overall leitmotif or motto for the next minutes is that Germany has undergone major, fundamental, substantial change in its defense policy since 2014, which could be put under the heading of relearning collective defense. I want to explain that main idea in 3 points. First, the changed threat perception of Germany. Second, what I would call relearning collective defense, or the NATO first approach. And I'm going to conclude with some sentences or some ideas on what we call in Germany the new responsibility in German security policy. So let me start with the first point, Germany's changing security paradigms. Many of Germany's security certainties or reference points have fundamentally changed over the last years, particularly since 2014. And that deeply affects the way Germany thinks about security and defense, and is likely to affect it also in the years to come. For Germany, it means mainly that 3 main cornerstone or reference points have changed: Russia, the US, and Europe. These are the kind of main angles where Germany perceived security and defense policy. Russia, I mean, that has been perfectly analyzed in this session before. The annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine has changed the relationship from a cooperative, or at least what Berlin thought was cooperative, to a confrontational relationship. And that was particularly for Berlin, who believed in what we call a modernization partnership, a particularly difficult lesson to learn. The German idea of modernization partnership was, if we only closely cooperate and exchange and interact, Russia might move toward what you call the Western model. That this modernization partnership didn't work and didn't succeed was a particularly painful lesson. Also because the then German foreign minister who had to deal with Crimea and Ukraine was the one who actually launched the modernization partnership. So there was several levels of learning processes. So Russia's readiness to use military force as a tool in Ukraine and Syria, the disrespect for rules and international agreements like the Budapest Memorandum, Helsinki agreements, the alleged violation of the NF Treaty, all that learned the Europeans, but particularly the Germans, to relearn the language of power and to relearn defense. And I underline it again, particularly for a country like Germany, understanding that the use of force is a tool you need to think about because your neighbors think about it is a particularly heavy lesson to learn. If you look at the German Defense White Book from 2016, this is exactly the lesson which is drawn in the White Book. That's the return of classical power politics, which brought military defense back to Europe. And that comes with a long list of unpleasant topics in Germany, like nuclear deterrence. So it's a major paradigm shift for German defense policy, and it has been the starting point for a major defense reform. The second major modification in the kind of German defense orbit is the US. We also touched upon that in the first session. I think we could probably put it from a German perspective under the label of uncertainty or doubt. The Russia paradigm shift hasn't really been digested, but the major change was ahead with Trump being elected. Under Trump, from a German perspective, the US interprets global responsibility and global leadership, the role of a guardian of a liberal world order based on rules, free trade, and certain institutions in a very different way than they used to do it in the past. And particularly in the area of security and defense, there's a lot of ambiguity. We have the rhetorical statements from Trump, who are disastrous from a German point of view, and then we have a major gap, and we have the facts on the ground which haven't changed. And this gap between the rhetorics on the one hand and the boots on the ground which haven't changed, this gap is uncertainty and doubts. And uncertainty is not something that we honestly appreciate in security and defense policy. And this is particularly problematic for a country like Germany, who strongly believes that there's no credible defense in Europe without the US in political, conventional, and nuclear terms. And for a country like Germany, who usually embeds its security defense policy in multilateral frameworks, Europe, NATO, and others. So that's what I would even call, from a German point of view, a second paradigm shift after the first that brought back collective defense and turned Russia into a challenge for European security. The third reference point that changed for German defense and security policy is Europe. Europe is getting a problem rather than a problem solver. Just to make some points to underline how deeply the role of Europe in the German political system changed. One element is Brexit. Brexit, above all, means doubts. Doubts that the divorce will take in a rather peaceful and civilized way. Doubts about the UK's future. Doubts about the future of the European integration project. And it sends worrying signals around the world. The EU loses political and diplomatic weight. If you don't have the UK at the table in EU meetings about security and defense, probably we use an actor who had a certain strategic culture and a certain strategic ambition. The EU loses military potential. Although we might come to it, the British military potential is changing, to put it in a friendly way too. I'll not say it's, I think Hodges say it's touching, it's frowning strategic irrelevance, but you might talk about it later on. So Europe is not longer that attractive model that Germany wanted it to have. You might remember the famous quote by then German Chancellor Kohl, who said that German interests and European interests are just two sides of the same coin. And if that kind of idea of Europe is getting weaker, we have a major problem. Another worrying development in Europe is the move towards authoritarian, illiberal, and populist regimes, combined with a questioning of the very basis of Europe's liberal order. For a long time, there was only one direction of the European integration process: further, closer, deeper. And now this integration is possible. There are certain countries who defy openly European roles or just don't stick to the roles, like taking refugees in. Authoritarian or illiberal populist regimes are pretty strong in certain countries. There are clear temptations to deconstruct the basis of liberal orders, just as limiting the freedom of speech, press, and judiciary. The election campaigns in my country, in France, in the Netherlands, in Austria, and Czech Republic all featured strong illiberal, xenophobic, nationalist, and authoritarian parties. And if they don't win, they don't need to win. They're here to stay, and they influence the public debate in a considerable way. And I put it under the heading of Europe, although that might be disputed by some. Turkey, as a big country in Europe or at the border of Europe, experienced one military coup and something that other people might call a second coup or putsch, which changes currently the political order. So the reference point of Europe is the stable point of reference for Germany has changed too. I don't even mention the external security challenges, migration, which is a major topic in Germany, the IS, and that all those crises are increasingly interlinked, and the international society, UN, EU, ONCE, are not really able to cope with it. So to put it very, very bluntly, from a German point of view, the world has become a lot more dangerous. And it's not longer about faraway countries about which we know little, like Afghanistan. It really touches the heart of what Europe is for us, so our liberal order and values. So that was a kind of rather long introduction, but I think it's extremely important to understand that the major points of reference for Germany have changed over the last 4 years, and that's particularly important for a country like Germany, which always sought to be embedded in the West and in a multilateral order. What is Germany's answer, my second point, to that changing security landscape? And I could put it under the heading of the German White Book, the 2016 German White Book, where one sentence reads, "Alliance solidarity is a fundamental principle of German governance." I think it's a weak translation, because in German we talk about Staatsräson, which is, I tend to think, a far stronger word than German governance. So the changes in German security and defense policy are underway since 2014. It's not yet accomplished. Also, it means for Germany, the reaction particularly to Russia, it goes beyond the strictly speaking military domain. It goes into the nexus of external, internal policies, like implementing resilience, which has a society dimension, an economic dimension, an infrastructural dimension. It includes catching up delays, like setting up a cyber command, which Germany didn't have in the past. And it also includes thinking about things like information war. The main driver for the change of the German defense policy was the crisis in and around Ukraine. And it made the main theme for the German defense policy since 2014 collective defense. This kind of relearning, reorientation, German defense policy towards collective defense was even more challenging, given that Germany was just undergoing a rather deep reform process started in 2010, 2011 with the defense political guidelines, which totally oriented the German armed forces for stabilization and crisis management outside Europe. It was about ending conscription, so turning the Bundeswehr into a professional army, orientated towards crisis management and stabilization, which was considered to be the most likely task, and to limit the personnel to 185,000 personnel. The driver for that reform then was the idea that stabilization was the most likely task, and the financial crisis was hitting the German defense budget. So until 2013, Germany systematically scrapped heavy equipment, which one would need for collective defense, just the tanks down to some 300. It also decided to put a lower level for the defense equipment. You only needed 70%, not 100, which was then to be distributed according to necessity. And it also stopped modernization and stopped procuring some spare parts. And then came Crimea and Ukraine. When NATO decided in 2014 to concentrate on collective defense, Germany made considerable commitments. And only shortly later had to recognize it was not able to fulfill that commitments, exactly because it has shrunk and cut and changed the armed forces in a considerable way. So as I said, the tank fleet was reduced to some 300s. Air fleets was reduced in the usability because spare parts were missing, equipment was missing. And when Germany was heading the first NATO VJTF, the first rapid reaction force, it had to take equipment from all areas of the Bundeswehr to be able to equip that small force. That was a rather sad picture at that time. So the big change since 2014 was then to orientate the armed forces not longer to the scenario which is the most likely, still crisis management, but to the scenario which would, if it were to happen, would have the most disastrous effect. That's the kind of idea change since 2014. So the learning effect, or the kind of what Germany need to change, was considerable in terms of finances, in terms of personnel, in terms of equipment. If you look at the German defense budget in 2015, roughly 33 billions. 2017, it's about 37, and it's supposed to increase to 38 next year, and possibly 42 billions in 2021. So there is a clear increase, at least in the budget. The main orientation, or the main driver, and the main kind of idea giver still remains NATO for the German defense forces. You might have heard a lot of hype in the German debate over the last 2 weeks, particularly about EU defense developments, particularly permanent structured cooperation, also called PESCO. And there were indeed some developments over the last 1.5 years where the European Union was able to catch up some delay in defense cooperation, mainly by setting up a coordinated annual review on defense card, which is about a synchronization of defense planning, the European Defense Fund, financial tools to financially support research, and joint projects in the European Union, setting up a military planning and conduct capability. And that idea of permanent structured cooperation, which should allow states who want to cooperate better. That's, on a political level, for Germany extremely important. For the armed forces, I think it's safe to say that it doesn't play a role. Which is rather interesting, because particularly the media hype 2 weeks ago when PESCO was notified was high, and there was talk about a European Defence Union being set up. So to make that short, the main change for Germany was Crimea. It meant the return to collective defense. It was a difficult learning process, which is not yet over, because it means to totally reorganize the armed forces. It means to catch up an enormous delay in equipment and personnel and in finances, and in all 3 areas the German armed forces are struggling to get the things done. I don't want to deny progress, but I think it's also honest to say that the work just started and we have a long way ahead of us. To finish my presentation, I want to make a last point, which is more general about German security and defense policy changing or not. So if you look at the debates in European security and defense, be it in the EU or NATO, there's one constant element coming up over the last year, and that is that Germany somehow should play a bigger role and take up more responsibility in European defense, be it Brexit, be it Trump, being Russia. According to the New York Times, Merkel is the last defender of the liberal order. That's a bit too much, and I can assure that she has I don't know her personally, but Germany has no ambition to be the last defender of the liberal order. But it shows the expectations are indeed very high. That, however, ties pretty nicely with the development in German security and defense policy over the last 4 years, particularly since 2014, that Germany is indeed increasingly trying to take up more responsibility and trying to match its security commitment with the political and economic weight it has in Europe. Make no mistake, though, it's not about Germany becoming trigger happy, and it's not about Germany becoming a cheap copy of France or the UK. It's rather the recognition that previous decisions, like the abstention in Libya, had turned Germany's image in security policy very dark, and that a country like Germany that is deeply embedded in international networks and profits from international stability should probably do a bit more to particularly protect and safeguard that stability from which it benefits so greatly. So it's more recognizing that we cannot shut ourselves off the world, and that probably those who provided security and stability for a long time might not longer be willing to do so also in the future. So it is actually in Germany's interest to be more committed and more engaged in protecting that world order from which we benefit. Starting point for the implementation of that change was the Munich Security Conference in January 2014, where we had 3 major speeches by the then Defense Minister, Foreign Minister, and President, who all stressed that line, that Germany should take up more responsibility, not longer standing at the sidelines and commenting upon what is happening, but Germany might need to take up a bit more of the burden for security policy. For Germany, that was a major change, because so far we were very comfortably hiding away from several commitments. So what has changed since 2014 is, for example, the strategic basis. 2016, we have a new white book on defense, which pretty clearly outlines the threat Germany is facing and the answers Germany wants to do. We have a reorganization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some sections of the MOD, particularly procurement. We have reviewed the law that organizes how the parliament authorizes deployments. Germany was catching up some delay in the armed forces, such as by setting up a cyber command. The defense budget increased, but I think the possibly biggest change happened in the deployments. Not that much seen, I think, by the broader public, but that's indeed a big change. The first was Ukraine, and I guess this test for the rhetorical ambition came much quicker than most of the German decision makers probably saw, because the Munich security speeches were in January, February, and Ukraine happened just afterwards. The way that Germany committed in NATO in political terms, to a great extent contributing to shaping the Wales and Warsaw summit declarations, within Wales a focus on readiness and responsiveness, and in Warsaw trying to make it a Hamel summit with pushing the double-track approach of deterrence and dialogue based on a strong deterrence, was remarkable. So the political commitment was remarkable, but also the military. Germany committed very quickly to literally all reassurance and defense measures, and was for a long time the strongest European contributor after the Americans. That has changed now, but at least in the beginning, it really turned out to be the conventional backbone. Germany contributed, for German standards, extremely quickly to the anti-IS coalition after the Paris attacks, getting a mandate ready overnight, which is very un-German for mandates. One of the biggest contingents at the moment is in Mali, and Germany is also in Iraq and training Peshmerga forces. So there is a major change. Most of this operation, I tend to think, would not have been possible 5 years ago, particularly not participating in a coalition like anti-IS, which is outside the usual frameworks like EU, NATO, UN, which Germany usually cherishes. Last element, which is also maybe a bit nerdish, but in terms of capability cooperation, Germany submitted to NATO a concept on how to organize defense cooperation in Europe in a systematic way called Framework Nation Concept. And the idea is that you have bigger states who offer a framework, a kind of backbone, and smaller states can plug in the capabilities, therefore together creating a joint capability or joint force. So far, 16 states have signed in to that MOU, to the Framework Nation concept. That makes Germany to a central state for European defense, and it's a very different way of asking the German question in European defense. It not only means that 16 states are to a certain extent depending on Germany, but also that Germany depends to a certain extent on 16 states for defense in Europe. So that's a very interesting development. So I tend to think we have a new quality in German defense policy. It's not longer the difficult candidate it was in the 2011 Libya situation. But, of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. So far, most of those reaction, of those living up to higher standards, have been crisis-driven. Reaction to Ukraine, reaction to the Parisian attacks. And there was less kind of proactive decision. The internal-external nexus, also for constitutional reasons, is still not yet entirely addressed. And the defense-industrial dimension remains the stepchild of German security and defense policy. Issues like arms export for jointly developed capabilities. There is a project to, with France together, develop the next generation fighter aircraft. But that would obviously involve the question who can, where, and when, and how export such a new aircraft. The same applies to the Franco-German idea of jointly of the Kant merger between the German and French heavy land things. Yeah, that's actually my almost last sentences. So the question is how election-proof these changes are. 4 years is not a long time to establish change. We don't know how the next government will be in Germany, but it's very likely to focus a lot on domestic policies. Defense and security policy is still not an issue to win majority hearts and minds in Germany. So the question is how election-proof, how future-proof that development is. And I tend to think, and that's maybe important to say that in Norway and in front of lots of allies and friends, I think it depends to a certain extent also how the partners and friends value that development and support it and kind of show Germany that's an appreciated development.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. As some might have guessed, Claudia also speaks perfect French, and we move over to the French perspectives. Etienne de Durand, please take the podium. He works at the French MOD's policy branch, and prior to that, he's been with the French Institute for International Relations. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to NUPI and to the organizers. Very happy to participate in that seminar. I will freely draw in my presentation from the very recently published French strategic review. It's only a few weeks old. You can look it up on the internet. And the English translation should be out in a few weeks for those of you who can't read French. So I'm not just to honor Franco-German friendship, I think I'm going to follow Claudia's lead, and I will also present the way we see our security environment first, and then talk a little bit about our response and the way we are now organizing it. So to begin with the environment, let me first take us back a little bit in the past. What were the traditional tenets of French security and defense policy in the post-Cold War era? First, there was no specific state threat. There were many risks that were identified: instability, terrorism, proliferation, etc., but no threat was designed as a threat per se. Strategic autonomy, which is a long-standing, of course, tenet of French defense policy, was entirely defined at the national level. Nuclear deterrence was regarded as key in buttressing that autonomy, but contrary to the Cold War period, it was not specifically addressed to a state. Well, the USSR was never named in French official documents of the Cold War, but quite clearly French nuclear deterrence was primarily aimed at the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Regarding our conventional capabilities, they were structured for our overseas operations mostly, whether autonomous operations, French operations, whether US-led operations in the Middle East or elsewhere. So the force structures, of course, reflected that double emphasis on overseas operation and nuclear forces. We had, as always, a few key conventional assets supporting our nuclear deterrent, but mostly we had expeditionary forces really primed for stabilization operation, or let's say mid-intensity operations like medium ground forces, fighter planes optimized for coalition operations and the such. Now, the way we see our environment has substantially evolved, first beginning with the white paper in 2013, and that white paper has been updated by the strategic review again that was issued a few weeks ago. So the tenets that I've just mentioned have evolved. First, let me recap how the strategic review, the French strategic review sees the world. Of course, we, as was the case before, we underline how risks such as migrations, organized crimes, etc., complicate both our homeland security, Europe's homeland security, but also external operations, stabilization operations. However, and this is where there is a change, we think the environment is substantially more dangerous now and unstable than had been previously envisaged. First, let me dwell a little bit on the first thing we talk about, which is jihadi terrorism. And not just because of all the terrorist attacks that have occurred in Europe, including in France, but because despite the demise of Daesh as a territorial entity, what we see is a continuation of jihadi terrorism and of the underlying organizations such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda. We see that its ideological virulence is intact. We see that its operational reach is still there, including in our homelands. And unfortunately, we have all of us have been able to test how resilient those organizations and this ideology is. So what is at stake, quite obviously, is for that generation of jihadis not to be able to actually breed another generation, but unfortunately it's likely that it will be the case because we see already a dispersion of Daesh fighters in many places from Afghanistan to Africa, and so they will embark with them operational knowledge and also, of course, ideological knowledge. So jihadi terrorism is there to stay, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. So when the French say that we have a 360-degree posture, we mean it. It's not just all about great powers or about the East, as we say in NATO parlance. We shouldn't lose sight of the South, and not just the French, but all European states and the West in general. Second, there is an issue that we dwell a little bit upon in our strategic review, and that's proliferation. That issue somehow got forgotten in the past decade or so. Probably in the West, it did have a bad press following the invasion of Iraq, and the fact that it's a very also technical issue that it's sometimes hard to grasp for the public. But quite clearly, the ongoing crisis with North Korea, or I should rather say the acute phase of a crisis that's been going on up and down, but going on for the last 20 years and 23 years with North Korea, is a clear illustration that proliferation has accelerated and is a huge problem. Proliferation is not just nuclear proliferation. I should also point out that it's the proliferation of advanced conventional systems to many different actors. So WMD proliferation and conventional dissemination, I should say, brings the West to the following situation. Second and third rate actors, including non-state actors today, and I'm thinking of, for instance, the Houthi using ballistic missiles in Yemen. So a non-state actor using ballistic missiles. The Taliban had done that before, by the way. So second and third rate actors have now access to significant capabilities that can challenge, at least locally or temporarily, Western military superiority. And this is something that we really have to take into account because it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And of course, ballistic and nuclear proliferation are now reaching a tipping point, so much so that in the strategic review, we now refer to what we call nuclear multipolarity. And that nuclear multipolarity will be very risky because it involves very disparate actors and actors that have chosen, including major states that have chosen to rely on opaque postures and doctrines, relying on ambiguity, and that was already alluded to before. Final thread that we analyze, that we see, is of course the return of great power competition. It's already been discussed several times. The return of great power competition manifests itself also in the military field. This is easily observable when looking at defense expenditures. I always like to remind French audiences, for instance, of the fact that Asia passed Europe in terms of defense expenditures 5 years ago, and that was a first, probably in 400 years or something like that. And actually, the gap is widening. So this is a clear reminder to all the European allies, at least, that the world's commitment towards 2% of GDP is something serious and not just a political signpost. So defense spending, also, of course, investment in high-end systems, long-range defenses or strike capabilities that allow for A280 postures, and we see those postures being erected in many different places, including along the borders of Europe. Also, of course, investments in dual-use and nuclear systems and nuclear modernization programs that are underway in all nuclear powers, some of them very ambitious. and also very specific capabilities targeting some of our collective weaknesses or dependencies, for instance, our space assets. So there is all those hard investments in very high-end capabilities. There is also, of course, investments in low-end covered capabilities allowing for ambiguous aggressions below the conflict threshold. All that paints the picture of the danger of what we call strategic intimidation coming from some great powers. Of course, all those trends were already visible a few years ago, but what we note in our strategic review is that we did not foresee all of those risks and threats to manifest themselves with such a degree of intensity and at the exact same time. So, again, we in a sense, we saw it coming, but not as fast and not everything at the same time. So that convergence of tensions between great powers, of threats and risks, explain why, for instance, French forces are as heavily committed as they are today, from the Sahel region to the Baltic states, from the North Atlantic to the Near and Middle East, not to mention the homeland, where we still have 7,000 troops every day patrolling our streets. We see also at the military level what we call a hardening of the environment, and also confrontation creeping in new domains such as cyber and space. All that, again, pointing to the blurring of boundaries between peacetime, crisis time, wartime, and that evolution lending itself, of course, to strategies of intimidation. Final worrying point is the fact that several great powers, including Russia and to some extent China, seem no longer interested in upholding the multilateral system upon which international stability was built. And Russia, for instance, actively undermining it with the illegal annexation of Crimea, of course, and not just that. So what is, given that bleak picture, what is the French response? President Macron announced, before even the strategic review, that France first would retain its nuclear deterrent, and second, that we would stick to our NATO commitment of spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2025. We are now at almost at 1.8, and we will start the increase next year. It's already been budgeted. I cannot give you too many specifics about how that increase will translate in terms of capabilities, because we are now discussing our military spending law, and the results won't be out until early 2018. But what I can do and will do is restate the principles that have been put forward in the review regarding the capabilities that we will need. First, we see nuclear deterrence has remained the cornerstone of our national defense, given the rise of proliferation that I briefly touched upon, and also the resulting nuclear multipolarity. And we see that, of course, as the cornerstone of French strategic autonomy, but we see it also as a necessity for the common defense of NATO and Europe. France will also retain what we call a full spectrum and balanced military, able to address all kinds of operations, from low-end peacekeeping or stabilization operations to high-intensity operations, up to nuclear deterrence, of course. There are things we will continue to be able to do entirely on our own. Nuclear deterrence is one of them. C4ISR, first entry capabilities, but we recognize that especially for long operations against state actors or very demanding forced entry operations in contested environments, we will need to operate alongside our allies and European partners. So in terms of capabilities, because that was one of the questions that was asked by the organizers, we will increase investments in intelligence, again in forced entry or A280 capabilities, and a few elements that we see as critical for high-end, high-intensity operations. And that's why, again, we will retain a full spectrum military, and to retain, and that is the message, of course, of one of the message of the strategic review, to retain a full spectrum military today and tomorrow in an environment that is becoming more and more demanding. You have to actually increase spending. You have to invest more just to stay where you are, in other words. Now, strategic autonomy is reaffirmed at the French level, but this time it's also affirmed in conjunction with European autonomy. we think that there is a rising awareness among European nations of shared interests in a much stronger way that used to be the case 10 or 20 years ago. Obviously, migrations are a common issue. Obviously, jihadi terrorism is a common shared threat. Obviously, all of us, we need to prevent great power, coercion, and encroachment all around our borders. And we also need to protect sometimes distant interests, but that affect all of us, including regional stability in the surrounding regions of Europe. So we want to approach, we want to help usher in a new era of European cooperation in terms of defense, and we want to approach that in a very pragmatic way. We want to promote everything that can work within an EU context, but also within the NATO context, obviously, and also at the bilateral and minilateral, nicknamed minilateral level. Everything that will help Europe and European countries to develop more capabilities. Now, again, we are supporting every initiative that can be sustained, that does not duplicate existing structure or arrangements, whether at the EU or NATO level. And more than anything else, we want capabilities that exist on the ground and not just institutional arrangements. So we have our NATO commitment, of course, we have our EU commitment, we have bilateral commitments, and by the way, not just in Europe, we also have defense agreements overseas and defense cooperation relationships with countries such as India and Australia. And of course, and I'd like to finish on that because that was also one of the questions asked, we have developed over the years a very strong and close military relations with the US in all our operations, whether French-led or US-led. And we see absolutely no contradiction between all those initiatives. Maybe this sounds a little bit un-French to you, but this is very pragmatic, and this is how we see the future of defense cooperation in Europe. But time is really for action. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Etienne. We proceed with the UK perspective. If you will, Professor Robert Johnson of Oxford University, where he is heading the Center for the Changing Character of War. The floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your insights on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. It's great to be here and have the opportunity of trying to explain to you what has already been a challenge, the inexplicable, something about UK defence policy. My first point is to say that we should not judge any strategy or any national defence policy by rhetoric. It's unreliable. And defence reviews are a very good example of that unreliability. It is far better to judge a defence policy by the enduring behaviour of a country rather than not. So if we look, for example, back at the British defence reviews of 2010 and 2015, they were described as an age of uncertainty. And we've heard that expression already described today. And I'm not advocating that, by the way, British defence policy is somehow by design ambiguous today. That's probably more of an accident. But many of my colleagues have already explained the sort of challenges that have transformed, I think, some of that sense of certainty that we enjoyed in the 1990s. Britain, like other NATO countries that participated in operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, is finding the post-intervention period and modernisation and changes quite challenging. The emergence of a self-evident Russian threat, the illegal annexation of Crimea and parts of Ukraine have been mentioned. And I think it's pretty clear that the consequences of the global financial crash of 2008, which have created an austerity agenda in Britain, have also been extremely challenging. But in those defence reviews, there were some other problems, really, and that was primarily that a lot of values were set out, a lot of ideas and aspirations of what Britain was supposed to be in the world, including a global agenda. the British claimed that they would be influencing parts of the world, that they would intervene to uphold international law and humanitarian law. Well, the problem is that Britain lacks really the means, is inadequate in its means to actually fulfill these aspirations, and has misaligned its ends and its ways, creating a disaggregated effect in British defence. The changes are coming faster than we had anticipated, a comment we heard a moment ago. And so that has caused itself some great grave difficulties and doubt. But let's just dwell for a moment on the things that you don't hear the British say about their own defence policy. I'm going to let you in on the national secret. Number one, above all else, remain close to, and by definition protected by, the United States. It's difficult to say this to a European audience, primarily you're European, but actually, if it was a stark choice between the United States and Europe, the British would choose the United States. Secondly, this is the other secret, adapt to changing circumstances to preserve enduring interests, protecting territory, population, sovereignty, and economy. And thirdly, uphold the international rules-based order. Although the British don't spell it out very often, they are absolutely committed to that third priority. Now, you know very well the British are strongly influenced by historical legacies, as well as the other global influences we've heard about today. We're about to receive from Norway that wonderful gift of a Christmas tree that gets established in Trafalgar Square. And that just is an indication of how much history bears on the British public. The British wish to avoid, in their defence policy, major, costly wars because of the sheer level of damage that they did in the First World War and the Second World War to Britain, its global position and its economy, and lives, obviously. Secondly, they wish to avoid isolation. I haven't got time to go into the detail, but you will know that Britain was proud of its isolation in 1940 in defying Hitler's Germany, but that isolation is generally regarded by British statesmen and women as a disaster. The last time that Britain found itself isolated in international affairs was in the Suez Crisis of 1956, which still has a ghostly, sort of threatening, lingering effect on British politicians today. And thirdly, and we shouldn't underestimate this historical legacy and influence on British defence policy, and that is to avoid Europe being dominated by a single power, particularly a single hostile power. Much of the anti-EU rhetoric which has surrounded the Brexit debate was really influenced by this profound sense that they didn't want a European superstate on their doorstep that could threaten them. Now, you may feel that to be absurd, but these are the deep-seated thinkings, if you like, that you don't hear the British often express, but are nevertheless there. So I would say, I would measure a policy, a defence policy, by enduring behaviour, not by statements. And ultimately, what do the British want? Naturally enough, they want to serve national interests. It's Britain first, without any of the connotations that might seem. Number two, protect the Constitution and their system of government. When an American politician came to tell the British public that they'd be mad to vote for Brexit, that created in the British public an immediate increase in the number of those who were going to vote for Brexit. So they take this idea of their natural independence and constitution extremely seriously. Thirdly, obviously, to promote their trade and what they now call the prosperity agenda. Again, terribly important to the British. When they were told that after the Brexit referendum, if they had voted for Brexit, there would be a crash in the British economy. Well, actually, the British economy has grown incrementally by a couple of percentage points, which, again, just seems to reinforce all the prejudices. Fourth, they need to work with their allies and coalition partners. And they, again, the British take that extremely seriously. In every defence review and in all their actions, you can see this enduring behaviour of working with their allies. And of course, finally, and not to be underestimated, obtain American support. They will always act, if they can, with American backing. So there are a lot of unfulfilled expectations in British defence policy. They've not been doing what they said they were doing. In the Iraq War, for example, despite saying that they're going to be close to the United States, the British government pulled out from Basra as the American armed forces were surging into the rest of Iraq. And the British military culture has not forgiven their own government for that betrayal of their closest ally. In remaining close to the United States, the presence of the British forces in Afghanistan is much lower than it was, and there's been a great deal of antagonism against President Donald Trump, despite this so-called close relationship. The British also claim that they are international by design in defence policy, which of course has sent really mixed signals to lots of countries. And now they are trying to make up the gap by actually committing forces to, for example, the Baltic republics, to Poland, and of course also a maritime presence now in the Arctic to protect Norway as one of our key allies. But their forces are rather inadequate for the tasks which they've set out in their defence reviews. Distances, for example, now and new generations of missile technology make new forms of shipping, like aircraft carriers, extremely vulnerable. Manpower manning crises continue to surface. We can't staff the number of soldiers, we can't staff the number of sailors that we need for our armed forces. And although the British have maintained over 2%, 2.2% of spending in line with NATO targets, actually some people have argued that they've included the wrong things in some of that budgeting. Now, on the positive side, the British have established a national cybersecurity centre. They have a joint expeditionary force alongside a combined joint expeditionary force, which provides the enhanced forward presence, as I say, in the Baltic. They have a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, an independent nuclear deterrent, but it wouldn't be used without American or European support. And they are, along with France, amongst the largest and best equipped independent forces in Europe, able to conduct their own operations, their own lift, enablers, surveillance and everything else. But there are some big problems coming. If the current government of Theresa May falls, as Angela Merkel and other European politicians have realised, the replacement government would be worse than the current chaotic government that we have. And by that I mean that if, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, as Labour leader, succeeds to the British government, you can say goodbye to a lot of British military assets. And indeed, as he's claimed, he will abolish the domestic intelligence service on which we rely for counter-terrorism. But let us just dwell for a moment on capability. I was asked to say something about UK capability. And I think capability consists of three things. One is the ability to make decisions. Secondly, it's about budget. And thirdly, it's about the algebra of war. It's about the technology and equipment and forces that you have. So let me just dwell quickly with those three things. Firstly, on decision-making. The Iraq inquiry, which was published this year, all 2.6 million words of it, make it very clear that the British political leaders have a very poor grasp of directing, designing, or executing strategy. They are complacent, and some MPs, some members of parliament, have been outspoken in their criticism of the United States and even of NATO. There are a lot of politically correct statements which get in the way of the hard truths of defence policy. For example, been lots of remarks recently how Britain's armed forces need to be more representative of the profile of the British population. Armies and navies and air forces are not to represent the nation, they are there for war. I think there is also a refusal to recognise the sheer scale of the defence problems and threats that they face. What about capability, though, in terms of budget? Well, about £34 billion a year is spent on defence, of which 17.8 billion is on new equipment. And put in long-term, 10-year terms, that's £178 billion will be spent on new equipment in the next decade. That represents about £532 sterling per person in the United Kingdom, and that will increase, I think, to around 600 in the next few years. On the other hand, if you look at the Brexit bill that's being discussed at the moment in Brussels, the 40 billion figure that's been cast around, as you can see, exceeds the UK defence budget and actually would be a substantial amount of the health budget of the UK economy. And that is going to cause probably the fall of the government, I would argue, in the next few months, if that goes ahead. And whether our European colleagues have quite realised how serious that is, I don't know, but you should be prepared for that eventuality now. And on the capability, in terms of forces, equipment and military readiness, the Navy argue that most of the needs, because Britain is an island, come by sea, and therefore they are the most important. There are about 77 ships, that's down from 120 in the 1980s, of which only 18, of course, are principal ships. But the submarine fleet, and now, of course, the 2 aircraft carriers and the carrier groups that will enable them, will give Britain back its maritime presence in the high north and indeed probably elsewhere in the world. The limitation, of course, being you can only put a carrier group in one place at a time. The Army argue that wars are won on land. So the Army have created a deployable division, a 3rd division, with a 2nd division that will come in and roll in behind that first one, should they be required. But of the 50 battalions that are available to the British, there are also 2 high readiness brigades, one air mobile and one amphibious, which can be used. And the British Army have also now brought in 7 Brigade and an ISR brigade to enhance their surveillance and their ability to conduct situation awareness. For the Royal Air Force, they will argue that all conflicts now are dependent upon air power, and the British have an 83 Expeditionary Air Group, where a substantial amount of that is currently in Qatar, but also 3 air groups based in the United Kingdom that can provide air defence over Northern Europe. And this is a reminder, this capability, I think, that the British feel that when it comes to Brexit negotiations, they are already paying the bill for European defence from the north, the northern flank of Europe, and therefore that gets very difficult when Europeans say they have to honour the commitments that they've already signed up to, and quite rightly. The debate in the military at the moment, in the British military, if you want to talk to your British military colleagues, they are discussing, as you are, what type of forces do we need for the future? How much specialism or balance do we maintain? What skill sets do we need to develop for the manpower needs of the future amongst 150,000 regular soldiers they have, regular forces they have, and the 80,000 reserves? And what research and development directions does Britain need to head into? And how much does it need to centralise or disaggregate and devolve its command and control? So in my remaining few seconds, I will just lay out, I think where some of the issues, I have another 4 pages of notes, and we'll skip those. Complicated issue, but a few sort of issues that I think are coming up that you need to be aware of. There you are. Stop. Thank you. The technology's gone insane. Quick, turn it off. This is what happens if you disobey technology. Yeah, good, I've destroyed it. Right. So I think, first of all, the big question that I get asked as I go around Europe and indeed the world is what will Britain's relationship with Europe look like post-Brexit? Well, I think, first of all, is to say that what's going on is a political dispute. I don't think it's going to affect, in the short term, European defence and security at all. And if we are to judge the British by what they do rather than what they say, let's not forget that a sizable proportion of Baltic defence is now in the hands or under the command of the British. British warships are in the Baltic. British warships and submarines are indeed in the high north. Let's judge them on that one. I think another issue which is coming up and has been mentioned is about the problem of protecting the public against terrorism, which is not 100% guaranteed. You can't stop all terrorist attacks, but that is absorbing quite a lot of the UK defence and security budget and attention at the moment. People are worried about the future of the private sector, particularly when it comes to research and development, and we are about to hold a defence review meeting about defence in space in 2 weeks' time. Nuclear capability is a big issue. Britain needs to commit £1 billion a year to the future development of its nuclear and upgrading of its nuclear capability, including Dreadnought-class submarines. Reserve forces are also needed in 2 places at once if there's a major crisis, and we're all worried about how well integrated British forces, police, and are for other issues. So, if I'm to sum up, I would say that there are a lot of challenges that Britain faces, which are not different from yours, of France and of Germany and Norway. We all face the same kind of problems, and Britain is doing, I hope, its bit in terms of defence and security to modernise its forces, spend the correct money, and bring ourselves up to an integrated nature. The exit from Europe is about the exit from European politics, not an exit from European defence and security. And I interviewed the Chief of Defence Staff only recently on this issue, and he was absolutely certain that the key word was reassurance to European allies. The British and the Europeans always need allies to be effective against larger and more threatening neighbours. We, frankly, need each other. But if you want a handy guide to understanding the British post-Brexit, think of Canada. It is a country close to the United States in values and in terms of what it wants to achieve militarily. It shares the same kind of mission sets as we do in Europe about humanitarian missions and operations being our preference and stabilisation. We will find ourselves doing war fighting at some point in the future. Canada is like Britain, not part of the EU, but closely aligned to the EU. Not necessarily in Europe physically, but actually committed to European defence. So in the future, I would suggest that Britain is the new Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. You started by talking about the close relation between the UK and US. And Professor Michta, the floor is yours. He's the Dean of the European Center at the Marshall Center for Security Studies. But you have stressed as a disclaimer that your views expressed here are private, your own views. The floor is yours. Please, the American perspective.
Thank you very much. It will be an American perspective. This will not be the American perspective. And as our host said, I'm speaking here in my private capacity. And my views and comments are not to be taken in any shape or form to express the official position of the Marshall Center, the Defense Department, or the US government. And since Janne and I are the only two things standing between you and lunch, and we have only 15 or 12 minutes left, I'll try to be brief. So rather than reading through brigade numbers and percentages and things of that kind, let me offer 5 broader geostrategic insights from my perspective. I've been back to Europe now for over a year and a half, and then say a few words that I think are practical from the point of view of where NATO is today and where the US commitment to Europe remains, and remains absolutely critical. First point I want to make, I would argue that there is a progressive trend towards an ever deeper regionalization of security optics in Europe. What is striking is that the crises that have developed not just on the eastern flank, we spent a lot of time talking about Russia, but also on the southern flank, have led to the kind of fragmentation and real difficulty in having the gut level, the visceral sense of a shared threat assessment as opposed to the often stated public pronouncements by politicians and the policy community or our leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. Especially the 2 events, one was covered here, that is Russia, Ukraine, but of course the migration crisis. Europe's southern border is now in the Sahel, and it is deep into MENA. It is no longer along the periphery of the Mediterranean. And just to use the old adage that nations live in neighborhoods and the security of that neighborhood defines how you see the rest of the world, we are now faced with a very profound challenge, I would argue, of reconciling those competing security optics so that when you live along the eastern flank in the Baltic states, or what used to be Central Europe, we still call it Central Europe, but it's increasingly morphing into something different, as opposed to you living in Spain, Portugal, France, Greece, or other areas, it is becoming harder and harder to come to a shared understanding of a common purpose. My country also lives in a neighborhood, so it happens that our neighborhood is global, and that poses another profound challenge for Europe because America's global perspective, our neighborhood is also in Asia, is also in MENA, and one of the things I hardly ever hear in the discussions in Europe is what kind of a position the Europeans would take, if any, should a crisis escalate rapidly in Asia. So that's one comment I want to put on the table. The second point is that, and I'd like to echo what Walter said about the expectations right after the end of the Cold War, Europe whole and free and at peace. Today you could say whole and free and at peace in the sky with diamonds, to show my age and my preference for the Beatles. That era is fundamentally over. And the scary thing is that maybe we are back in a kind of modern equivalent of the 1930s, where old institutions plug along, but confusion seems to reign unabated, while leadership fails at every turn. The striking part of that end of the post-Cold War period is that it's not something that should have surprised us. We had warnings in 2008. That was the Bucharest NATO summit, where we were unable to offer either the Georgians or the Ukrainians the membership action plan. Then we had the Russian-Georgian war, which brought state-on-state violence back to Europe's periphery, and then Ukraine finally showed that the German normative foreign policy and security policy design was not workable, and that we're back into essentially something that never disappeared, which is history continues at its merry pace. That means that the momentum of what I would call west to east enlargement, and notice that now even Western analysts speak of NATO expansion, which is a quintessentially Russian term, incidentally. We used to talk about enlargement as an organic process of free people making democratic choices. All of that has been not only stopped, but the momentum has reversed. Competition is now no longer just over the geostrategic space in Ukraine. It is increasingly in the Baltics, it's in Poland, it's in the Balkans. The Balkans, by the way, have gone unmentioned here, are a profound powder keg right now with challenges that are accelerating. The third point I want to make is that Europe is unready for war, period. I mean mentally, I mean psychologically, I mean in terms of political will. If deterrence by tripwire is supposed to work, it presumes the willingness, should deterrence fail, to threaten that we will in fact go to war. Several months ago, Pew Global Center did a study across Western Europe asking a simple question: should your country go to war in an Article 5 contingency? The majority was overwhelmingly no. Now, public opinions don't decide by themselves on whether the country will go to war, but that is a sobering result if you think about where we are psychologically, since especially we still have roughly only 62,000 personnel in Europe, maybe 30,000 of that is army, and the Europeans have, in effect, I would argue, and if I sound too harsh, please bear with me, over the last decade before Ukraine, disarmed effectively, essentially reducing their military establishments to a point where they've become marginalized. The German defense cut was about 40% overall. Not surprising that Germany has so much trouble trying to come up with capabilities now as NATO has entered the new post-Warsaw phase. And the final point I want to say is we cannot talk about European defense without talking about what's happened to the European project. The European collective project is, in my estimation, at a profound inflection point. The concept of European federalism, as it was construed from Chancellor Kohl eras on, suffered probably the most severe blow in 2008 over Greece and the whole idea of how the federal structures would continue to march on. The fact that we're today talking about two-tiered Europe with glee, at least not all of us, some of the European bureaucrats that I talk to in Brussels say that now that finally the British are out, we can actually get this done right. Ladies and gentlemen, a two-tiered Europe means in effect the end of the notion that Europe can both deepen and widen, and means in effect giving up on what has been a huge strategic gain for Europe, which is the bringing into the fold the entire former gray area, what we used to call Eastern Europe, but in effect is now Central Europe, the Baltics, and so on. Furthermore, I don't believe it's going to happen, because with the British departure, the second largest economy in the EU and the largest non-Eurozone economy, the balance between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone will shrink from roughly 30% in non-Euro with the Brits to about 10–11% once the Brits are gone. The gravity of that change in and of itself will lead to the further splintering, but at the same time, because on security issues, countries in the Eurozones, especially such countries as the Baltics, may cluster completely differently than the traditional Eurozone countries. You may have a Europe not of two tiers, but a Europe of clusters, aka a mess. which means we need to think about the next step for the larger context of European security. So that's on the geostrategic side. Now let me make a few comments about where I think we are with NATO and with our capabilities. We have deterrence by tripwire. I think it's very important that after Wales and Warsaw, NATO has deployed the 4 multinational battalions, has a brigade combat team rotating through Poland. It's a heel-to-toe rotation, and we are committed, and I want to emphasize this, the United States is committed to the security of Europe. I know that a lot that you've read in European press about various statements by candidate Donald Trump and then President Trump have been quite selective, I would argue. And if you look actually at what we do rather than the campaign rhetoric, the United States is demonstrating not only that it remains committed to Europe, but also we are now in the process of talking of putting more troops into Europe again. And that's a very serious conversation that is taking place with our allies and partners. But for deterrence by tripwire to work, we have to face the fact that we're in one of the most rapidly changing, and I would argue the most dangerous security environment, quite frankly, in my lifetime, especially if you look since the end of the Cold War. Not because we're looking at the same level of potential annihilation as we did in the Cold War era, but because the intel threshold has become very low, decision level threshold has become even lower. The Russians have demonstrated their capacity to mobilize thousands of troops, 40, 80,000, do your pick. If you look at Zapad 17, you can say even higher. In a 48 to 72-hour period, if you know anything about how NATO works, that's a wake-up time for the ambassadors after a long weekend in Brussels. I'm not being flippant. I'm simply saying SACEUR needs the authority to act in a crisis. The troops that we have now positioned as tripwires to deter aggression need to have sufficient artillery support. They need armor. They need air and missile defense systems. And most of all, they need very clear rules of engagement, which brings me to my last point, because I don't want to take away from the 2 minutes that are left to Janne. For the military in this audience and all the security experts, capabilities that are not exercised are vaporware. We can talk about it until we're blue in the face. I find it striking that even as various, wiser than me people debate what would happen if the Baltics were invaded and liberation strategies we would pursue, I have this nagging thing in the back of my mind that when I was growing up, I remember something that was called Reforger, and everybody did this in Europe, and we actually had exercises, and we knew what everybody would be doing, and I keep looking for Refor Bolt, Refor Pole, or Refor whatever, and I don't see much of it. My plea is we need to address some of the very urgent issues that we have in front of us. General Hodges likes to talk about having 30,000 troops that he has to make look like 300,000. I think the Russians can count. So the reinforcement, the ability to move troops across the alliance, what Ben Hodges calls the NATO Schengen, is an absolute must. It takes up to 15 days now to get all the permits cleared to move our troops. Access to rail, access to roads. Please remember, Germany remains the principal entry point for US forces into Europe. Whether you like it or not, that's where it is. We need to have the ability to not only move the troops in, but also pre-position stocks, be able to deploy them, and most of all, be able to defend them. Which brings me to the final point, which I think is urgently confronting us, and that's the 3 bubbles that we have along this flank. One is around 2 AD bubbles. One is over Kaliningrad, the other one is increasingly over Crimea, and the third one partly over Eastern Mediterranean, because the Russians operate out of Syria as well. And we are playing almost like a kiddie soccer game, running up and down the field trying to address it. I would argue that we need collectively, SACEUR needs exercise capabilities, exercised, emphasis on that, not just theoretical, to show that we can break decisively through those A2 and AD bubbles in an all-out confrontation, and only then, I would argue, we will have more than deterrence by tripwire. And on this cheerful note, let me turn it over to Janne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Michta. Now the Norwegian perspective, Professor Janni Holland Matalari of the University of Oslo. And the floor is yours, and as expedient as possible, Michta set a very good example.
Thank you very much, yes. You're now about to learn that there's no such thing as a free lunch, because you're supposed to have lunch right now, but you have to listen to me. Now, I'm going to speak about the fifth great power, presumably, since Norway is in this exclusive group of countries. That was supposed to be a joke. But I've had some aid. I can do it perhaps in less than 15 minutes with the defense minister as my warm-up band earlier today, detailing the Norwegian defense structure. What I want to focus on is exactly this tripwire deterrence idea and the ability to act, the will to act, not only the capability. If we look at this book, this is one published last year with colleagues at the Defense College here, looking at Russian ability and Russian interests. I'm not an expert on Russia, but others are. And it is quite impressive if we look at what one can achieve with realpolitik, with saber rattling, with the use of force and so on. It's quite clear that Clausewitz is right about the political effects of the use of force if you use it properly, if you use it politically with the political aim you want to achieve. This is something very, very unknown, very unfamiliar to most European politicians today, because we are in a almost postmodern, liberal, democratic mindset. This is sort of a view of the world where realpolitik is a bygone stage of history. Only that it isn't, as we now know. But the problem for Europe is the inability to act strategically, I would argue. And acting strategically means that you must be able to have a unified action capability, you must be able to clarify your goals, you must be able to, in the military sphere, to deter effectively, to coerce, perhaps contain, even confront. And those hang together. You can't deter unless you can confront. And tripwire is, in a way, the cheapest form of deterrence and the most insecure, risky form of deterrence. Our little youngest girl, she used to say when she was little, "If I get an ice cream now, I shall not start to scream." This is a sort of maximalist, coercive diplomacy. That was a natural for her. She now works in the immigration police, deporting people. But there is something here that is vitally important, and that is that when other actors act according to the old rule book of realpolitik, and they clearly do, then Europeans have to be able to respond and not only be reactive. And deterrence, the key question, the controlling question, which determines whether it works, is in Norwegian from a skit on TV. It is "Vart du skremt nå?" Did I scare you now? It's a neighbor up in Trøndelag trying to scare his other neighbor by all sorts of tricks. And the question is, did I scare you now or not? And if you don't scare anybody, you have failed in deterrence. So this, I would argue, has something to do with the other theme we touched on, and where Professor Mead gave an exposition on this, that there's something problematic, deeply problematic about the status of the nation state in Europe today. That unless people, in a way, have a conviction that they will defend their nation, what else is there to defend? Why do you need defense forces in the first place? So nation state with an element of patriotism hangs together with all defense deterrence possibilities. This has to do with the mindset. That the nation state, not only is it the basis for all democracy, it is also the basis for all traditional strategic action and defense and security policy. So this is something, it's as if this primer of politics that democracy presupposes a nation and that defense policy presupposes patriotism, that these elements have been forgotten largely in Europe. One is relearning it the hard way through elections, where people vote for parties that talk about these themes. But the Brexit vote was, according to a RAND study, 49% of the voters voted in order to retain democracy and sovereignty. 30% voted because they feared unchecked migration. So here we have border control, the nation, and democracy hanging together. And this is very, very important because we see it in election after election, and we also saw it in the election of Trump. Just back to the more easier thing, namely Norwegian defense. I think here one has, like in Finland and so on, one has a sort of realism in security and defense which has been continuous in Norwegian history. I was part of the expert commission tasked with looking at high-end threat and the ability of the little Norwegian defense force to deal with that. What was possible to do at home, what was allied necessity. And we came up with what we called seamless deterrence. Seamless is, of course, a biblical term from the robe of Christ. Nobody knows that anymore, but seamless means you have no seam, so you can't tear it apart. So it's therefore much more resilient. And this is, I think, the key problem for a country like Norway with limited resources, although we have these increases as we heard about this morning. What does Norway do? Because the tripwire concept is the same as in the Baltics. It's a small force, and what we in our expert group concluded is that there is, it all depends on allied integration, on allied assistance, but it is not sort of the allies will come and we can just sit here. I think the key logical connection is that commitment, as Andrew Michter talked about, commitment, US commitment. Commitment presupposes commitment, meaning unless this country does really a very good job at defending itself, at solving its own problems, others will not solve the problems for us. So unless one is very valuable as an ally, allies will not be very interested. And at the core of this, we can do this, that, or the other thing, conscription, and so on and so forth. But with the drawdown on defense budgets, which has to do with buying power, how buying power is diminished given the cost of modern equipment, and it also has to do with societies that are liberal democratic and do not put priority on defense unless they really have to, forced to. There is sort of the only deterrence affordable is this concept of tripwire. Putting it very briefly, what this defense force, which may be typical of smaller and medium-sized countries, needs is to improve on the strategic leadership decision-making organization. This is also a liberal democratic problem, isn't it? The fragmented state where the justice ministry will quarrel with defense about who owns the problem. New public management accountability will prevail. There will be very little strategic sort of logic to how one deals with anything unless one is really in a very pressed situation. And one could also remember that the Cuban Missile Crisis, Graham Allison showed empirically back in '62 how the Kennedy administration had various policy responses depending on the actors, on whether it was state or justice or the Pentagon. So how can we achieve strategic actor capability in European liberal democracies? It's a big question. France and Britain are the two strategic actors traditionally who have this ability. Sometimes I think too much political correctness impinges on British politics in this regard. France has insulated its decision-making chain more than other countries and is much more able to act quickly in the office of the president. But this is a key issue given the fact that lead times today are almost non-existent. They are extremely short. What do you do with a renegade? 5 minutes of decision time, something like that. So this is, there's something about technology, cyber, missile, and actors who have no fear of, who cannot be deterred, like terrorists, that make this extremely complicated for a liberal democracy. So let me end on just some notes on deterrence, the deterrence part of this. This is also where we see maybe a particular problem for Norway being so long, having this long coastline, being a vast country in terms of coastline. This is a cold response exercise, which is not in the far north, but in the north. It is in Troms, and from Troms to Finnmark, it's another 1,000 kilometers. And my eldest son, who is a tank officer, when they transported his tanks up to the exercise in Finnmark 2 years ago, it took 5-6 days on a boat. So I mean, the reaction time question is extremely critical given the rapidity of or the little lead time. Another thing that is important about about the north is, of course, the strategic importance to Russia. That's the key point about northern Norway and the Barents Sea. And this also allows for, in a way, a fantastic exercise opportunity for NATO and for Norway. Norway is the host country of Trident Juncture. Next year, 40,000 soldiers about, and there are no such places of conducting such large exercises with all capabilities involved in Europe today. So here is something which is a tool for integration with allies, where there is a win-win, I think. So this is an important advantage for Norway. But it doesn't resolve the problems of lead time, distance, where to be at where to have a military presence, far up in Finnmark, how much to commit in that area when you perhaps need it farther down. And we haven't solved the problem of how to have air protection for the new planes and number of air bases. So there are many sort of problems in the puzzle, as you see. But the vital part is that there must be as much, from our point of view, allied presence, exercise, integration as possible. And it's very true that we see a regionalization. Russia is seen as an issue for Northern Europe primarily. We group around Britain, Northern Group, JEF, cooperation bilaterally, training in the north and so on. So Britain is the lodestar for Norway and has been, I should say, since 1905, when we elected to have a monarchy after having seceded illegally from the union with Sweden. Then we were a bit afraid of military reactions. And therefore, these Republicans from Bergen under Christian Michelsen opted for the monarchy again, not because they were monarchists, but there was then the daughter of the British king available to become queen. So Queen Maud was the security guarantee until 1940. Then we had a 5-year sort of external shock, and then we were back to looking to Britain, and then looking beyond Britain to the US. So the US special relationship with Britain, there's a Norwegian special relationship with London, and we try to be special also in Washington. So this is existentially important to this country, but it's also, as you've heard, it's really important to figure out how to integrate militarily, given the cost, but without losing too much of the sovereignty. And this is something one is very wary of in NATO, in the EU. But this is going to happen. This has to happen. And I think it will be clusters around key allies where one has common interest, which means for Norway, primarily Britain, but it should also mean much more of a development of a relationship with France, because Maghreb, we are in Mali and so on, and all this is not going to go away. The irregular warfare aspects and terrorism aspects. So in conclusion, since you are now dying to have more than food for thought, I would just remind the audience of the insights of Thomas Hobbes, who wrote about why we need a state in Leviathan. It was a state like a Leviathan. The state is needed to provide collective protection because it's too expensive and sub-rational to do it oneself. So one pays taxes to have police, and one pays taxes to have a military force to defend borders. So without this need, collective need for the public good security, there wouldn't be the need for the state. And this is in many ways, we are back to this ABC of politics today also in Europe, when borders cannot be controlled anymore, when terrorists can enter, when security problems exist along many dimensions inside the state as well, and when there's revisionism from great power politics abroad, then the Hobbesian question is there again, and that's why citizens ask, in a way, who can provide, which politicians, which government can provide the basic goods that we need, namely security, and then number two, jobs, and so on. So this is not a time for sort of political rhetoric along changing the world too much. It's a time for consolidation at home, primarily, I think. And this marks we are now in a period, in a type of international politics which is markedly different from the optimism of post-Cold War globalization and liberal democracy spreading in a flat world. It's not like that anymore, and we should be able to resurrect knowledge about strategic interaction in order to deal with this effectively. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Janne. Thank you, Claudia, Etienne, Robert, and Andrew for riveting presentations. We'll kick off the debate after lunch. You'll get a round of an opportunity to comment on one another's introductions. There's lunch. Take the Kevlar off. Lunch is found on both sides, so we'll start again in half an hour. A quick lunch break. See you all back then.